Easy. You're safe here.
Who are you?
Name's Gideon Shaw.
Don't come any closer.
Eat if you want. I won't touch you.
Why did you save me?
She was half frozen against his fence he carried her in, warmed her up, and asked nothing in return. Follow for story, the story of a woman who learns to own her life, and the man who never once tries to take it from her. High Pass Ranch, Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Colorado, 1,874. The cold came down from the peaks like something with a grudge. It wasn't the clean, bracing cold of December. This was February cold, the kind that got into the bones and stayed there, that cracked fence posts in the night and killed calves before morning. The kind that made a man reconsider every choice, that led him to live this high up in the mountains, far from any town, far from any voice but his own. Gideon Shaw didn't reconsider. He never did. He was up before first light, the way he'd been every morning for 6 years on this ridge. No bugle to rouse him. No sergeant barking in the dark. Just the old soldier's body, waking itself up at 4, because the war had rewired something deep in him, something that couldn't be undone. He moved through the cabin by feel and habit. Boots on, rifle off the hook, beside the door. 2 fingers checked the cylinder of his Navy revolver. 6 rounds. Always 6. He stepped outside. The wind hit him in the face like an open hand. The blizzard had come through in the night, and it had come hard. The yard was buried past the top of the lower fence rails. His breath hung in the air for a second, before the wind tore it apart. He stood on the porch and looked out over what should have been a view of the South Valley and the dark tree line beyond. Instead, there was just white, everywhere. White, he went to the barn first, always the barn. The cattle were crowded together in their stalls, restless but alive. He forked hay, broke the ice in the water trough. With the blunt heel of an axe, checked the heifers one by one. His hands moved without thought. Steady, sure work. The barn smelled of warm hide and manure and dry straw, and it was about 30 degrees warmer than outside. He stood still for a moment in that warmth before going back out into it. The fence line had to be walked. It wasn't optional. Creed's timber scouts had been pushing at his western perimeter all winter. Not openly. They never did it openly. They'd cut a post here, loosen a wire there, leave a gap just wide enough to push cattle through. Small legal mischief. Small enough to deny. Gideon had started walking his fence every morning after the first incident, back in November, when he'd found 3 of his steers missing, and the western post snapped clean at the base. He pulled his coat tighter and went. The drifts came up past his knees in places. He broke trail with his thighs, rifle slung across his back following the fence posts south. His cheeks burned. His fingers, even inside the heavy gloves, went wooden and slow. He kept moving. The south drift fence was a 1/4 mile from the cabin, stretched across a natural draw where the wind funneled down off the ridge and piled snow in shifting, treacherous walls. The drifts against the fence could get 8 or 10 feet high after a storm like last night's. He'd lost a steer to that draw before. Found it in spring, half out of the snow, eyes sunken and fixed. He saw the shape from 40 feet out. At first, it was just a disruption in the smooth white surface of the drift. A dark smear against all that blank. He stopped walking. His hand went to the rifle by instinct, a reflex from a decade of moving through places where strange shapes in the landscape meant something coming at you fast. He waited. The shape didn't move. He went forward, slower now, watching the tree line on both sides. Creed's men had tried one ambush already, last November, though they'd been careful to make it look like an accident. A gate left open, 3 hired riders waiting in the trees. Nothing provable, nothing that would hold in any court. He hadn't forgotten. He got within 10 feet and stopped. It was a person, a small person, curled against the base of the drift fence like a child trying to hide, half buried in blown snow. The wind had packed fine crystals over them. He couldn't see a face yet. He could see clothing thin, dark, entirely wrong for this weather. He could see one hand uncovered, fingers slightly curled against the fence post. The skin of that hand was a color he recognized. He'd seen it before on the battlefield on men who'd been lying in cold mud too long. He covered the last 10 feet in 2 strides and crouched down, a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, maybe younger. Her face was buried sideways against the snow, dark hair plastered frozen to her cheek. Her lips had that gray-blue cast to them. Her coat, if you could call it a coat, was a man's work jacket, threadbare, at both elbows, far too large and not nearly enough. Below it, a skirt, a plain frontier skirt, soaked through and frozen stiff. On her feet were ankle boots. The leather split along the sole on the right one, and both were packed solid with ice. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat. He held his breath and waited. There it was, faint and slow, but there, a pulse. "All right," he said aloud, to no one. To himself, maybe. To her, maybe. He got his arms under her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. That was the first thing that alarmed him. He was a big man, lean, but built from years of hard labor and a soldier's conditioning. And he'd expected more resistance. Instead, she came up like something hollowed out. Her head fell back against his arm, and her eyes didn't open. Her fingers hung limp. He turned back toward the cabin and walked as fast as the drifts would allow. The fire was already burning low when he came through the door. He went straight to the hearth and put her down on the rag rug in front of it. On her side, the way you handled someone whose body temperature was dropping. He threw 2 more logs on the fire and didn't wait for them to catch before he started working. Her boots first. He drew his belt knife, not to frighten, just the fastest tool, and cut the frozen laces. Because they wouldn't untie. He worked the boots off slowly, easing them free rather than pulling. Her feet were white at the toes. He wrapped them in the heavy wool blanket from the chest by the door and began rubbing, careful and firm, working the blood back toward the surface. Then the coat. He hesitated for just a second, not out of indecision, out of deliberateness. He was aware that this was a woman who was unconscious, and whatever had driven her out into a blizzard in clothing like that was not a good story. He didn't know her. She didn't know him, and when she woke up, he intended for her to feel safe. He worked efficiently, and without looking where he didn't need to look. The coat came off buttons undone, not cut, because buttons could be replaced. Beneath it was a plain cotton blouse, also soaked through. He swapped it for one of his own flannel shirts, largest he owned, working the exchange the way he'd learned to handle wounded men in the field when they couldn't help themselves. Quick, purposeful, his eyes on his hands, not on her. He got her into dry wool socks. He got the second blanket around her shoulders, and the first one folded back over her feet. He pulled the rocking chair close to the fire and sat, not hovering, just present. Then he put a pot of water on to heat and waited. She was still for a long time. He watched the color in her face change by degrees. The grayness retreated, slowly, first from her cheeks, then from around her mouth. Her breathing deepened. The fire cracked and popped, and the snow hissed against the window glass. Outside, the wind was still running hard. He drank a cup of coffee. He reloaded the rifle out of habit. He watched her breathe. Around mid-morning, she stirred. Not awake yet, just a small convulsion of muscle, a shiver working through her whole body at once. And then her fingers moved against the blanket. Her brow pulled together. She made a sound low in her throat, barely audible. He stood up from the chair and took a step back, gave her room. Her eyes opened, dark eyes, brown maybe, or something close to it, hard to tell in the firelight. Disoriented at first, moving around the ceiling, then the walls. Then they found him, and they went wide, and she was scrambling before she was even fully awake, pushing herself up and back against the stone face of the hearth, clutching the blanket to her chest, her bare feet scrabbling on the rug. "Easy," he said. He said it the way he'd say it to a spooked horse. Low. No urgency in it. She wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on him, and she was breathing in short, sharp pulls, and her gaze had gone to the door and back to him and to the door again. Calculating. He took 3 deliberate steps back and sat down again in the rocking chair, in the far corner of the room. "You're not a prisoner," he said. She didn't answer. Her hands were pressed flat against the hearthstones behind her. Her chin was trembling. Though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't have said. "My name is Gideon Shaw. This is my property. I found you against the South Drift fence this morning." He paused. "You were about an hour from dead still." Nothing, but her breathing slowed a fraction. He kept his voice even. "There's warm water on the stove and salt pork from last night in the pan. You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to explain anything, but you should eat." She looked at the stove. He watched her look at it. "I won't come near you," he said. "If you want food, you can get it yourself. Plates on the shelf, to the left of the stove. Help yourself." He got up from the chair slowly, telegraphing every movement, and walked to the far side of the room. He sat down at the table by the window, his back mostly to her, and went back to the maps he'd been looking at earlier. The fence line survey he'd drawn up himself last month, marking every place Creed's men had been cutting. He didn't look at her. He heard her move after a while. The soft scuff of wool socks on the floorboards. The clink of the plate against the shelf. The sound of food being eaten carefully, like someone who wasn't sure when they'd eat again. He kept his eyes on his maps. She was back against the hearth by the time he turned around. Sitting now, not pressed against the stones in panic, but sitting with her knees drawn up and the blanket around her, the plate on the floor beside her. Mostly clean, she'd eaten everything. She was watching him with those dark, wary eyes. He pulled his chair a reasonable distance from her, not close, not performatively far, and sat. "How long were you out there?" he asked. A pause. She seemed to be deciding something. "Since before dark," she said. Her voice was rough, low a little, like it hadn't been used much. "Yesterday evening, then. She'd been against that fence for 12 hours or more in a February blizzard." He didn't say that aloud. "Where were you headed?" Another pause. "Away," she said. He nodded. That was a complete answer as far as he was concerned. "You came up the East Canyon Trail?" he asked. It was the only way up to the high pass from the valley floor that didn't require crossing Creed's timber claim. Her eyes shifted. Surprised, he knew it. "I didn't know it went anywhere," she said. "I just kept going up." He almost said something about that, kept it to himself. She'd walked blind into a high-altitude pass in a blizzard, with split boots and a borrowed coat. Whatever she was running from had been worse than that. He filed that fact quietly and didn't comment on it. "You can stay until the weather clears," he said. "That's not negotiation. It's practical. The temperature's going to drop again tonight, and you haven't got the gear to go anywhere." He paused. "After that, your business is your own." She was quiet for a long time. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind gave a long, low moan across the peak above the cabin. "Why?" she said finally. He looked at her. She met his eyes directly. And there was something sharp in her expression. Not quite suspicious. More like someone who'd been told things were free before and found the cost later. "Because you were dying in my fence line," he said. "I wasn't about to leave you there. Plenty of men would have. Plenty of men do a lot of things I don't do." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the fire. "Clara," she said. It came out quiet, almost like she had to think about it first, like she was deciding if she was willing to give him that much. "My name is Clara." "All right, Clara," he said. He got up, took his coat from the hook, and pulled it on. "I've got afternoon chores," he said. "Cattle need another round of feed, and the water trough will be iced over again. I'll be in the barn for an hour, maybe more." He paused at the door. "Door's not locked. From the inside or the outside." He looked back at her once. She was watching him with those careful eyes. The blanket pulled to her collarbone, her dark hair still damp at the ends, and curling slightly from the heat of the fire. She looked young. She looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was trying to figure out if she could set it down for just a minute without the world collapsing. "The shelf above the stove," he said. "There's dried apple rings and some hardtack, if you're still hungry." He pulled the door shut behind him. The cattle needed exactly what he'd said they needed. He threw hay, broke ice, checked the heifers again. One of them, a young roan he'd been watching, was moving stiffly. He ran a hand along her side and felt the tension in her flank. Not sick. Getting close to her time. He'd have to watch her. He worked in the barn for an hour, maybe a little more. When he came back in, stomping snow from his boots in the doorway, Clara was still by the hearth. She hadn't moved the chair, or searched the cabin, or done anything he might have expected from someone calculating an exit. She'd just stayed there. The plate had been rinsed and set back on the shelf. The blanket was folded neatly over the arm of the rocking chair. She'd found the dried apples. She was eating one when he came in, and she stopped, and then after a moment she kept eating, which he took as a small good sign. He shrugged off his coat. "Roan heifer in the barn might calve early," he said. "More to himself than to her. I'll need to check her again tonight." Clara said nothing, but her eyes went to the frosted window. "Storm's not done," he said, "but it's lighter than this morning." He put a pot on for soup. Salt pork again, dried beans, a few withered turnips from the root cellar. He worked at the stove with his back to her and talked while he worked, not demanding responses, just filling the silence with ordinary things. Where the trail to the valley went, how the creek ran fast in spring thaw and froze solid by Christmas, the way the elk came down to the south meadow in early November to dig through the snow for grass. Ordinary things, safe things. She listened. He could tell she was listening even without looking. He served 2 plates and set one on the hearth side and took his to the table without comment. She ate. He ate. The fire burned down and he added another log. Later, when it was full dark outside and the wind had dropped to a dull press against the walls, she spoke without him prompting her. "They'll come looking," she said. He looked up from the maps. "Who will?" She stared at the fire. "My husband. A beat. My father's people." He thought about what that meant. The road she'd taken up the East Canyon in winter dark, alone, nearly dead from it, and the fact that what she was running from still felt like the more dangerous option. "Let them look," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. "This is my land," he said simply. "My perimeter. Nobody comes through it without my knowledge." She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was complicated, like she was trying to translate what he'd said into something she had language for, and finding the words slow to come. "I'm not easy to take care of," she said. It sounded like a warning, or maybe a confession. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. He set down his pencil. "I'm not looking for anything from you, Clara. People get to just exist without earning it, as far as I'm concerned." The fire cracked. Outside, somewhere far up on the mountain, the wind was a long, falling note. Clara looked down at her hands in her lap. Her fingers were still slightly reddened from the frostbite. She looked at them like she was seeing them from a distance. "All right," she said at last. It was barely a whisper, but she said it. Gideon nodded once and turned back to his maps and let her have the silence. The storm grumbled on through the night. The fire held. And in the morning, the sky above the Sangre de Cristo range came up clean and pale blue and cold as iron, and the drifts threw back the light like broken glass. And Gideon Shaw went out to check the south fence line again. This time there was no one against it. But in the cabin, a plate had been rinsed. An apple ring sat on the shelf, half-eaten and left for later, like someone who had decided, quietly, to believe there might be a later. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. She woke up swinging, not fully awake. Somewhere between sleep and terror, that gray country where the body acts before the mind catches up. Her hand found the split cedar peg on the floor beside the hearth. She must have picked it up the night before. Without thinking, must have tucked it close while she slept. And she was on her feet with it, raised before her eyes had fully opened. Gideon was across the room. He was standing at the stove with a tin cup in his hand and his back mostly to her, and the sound of her scrambling upright made him turn. He took in the situation in about 1 second. The peg raised in her right hand, her feet planted wide on the rug, her chest heaving. He set the cup down on the stovetop with a small, deliberate sound. Then he turned fully to face her, both hands open and visible at his sides, and took one slow step back, just one, until his shoulders were against the wall. "Morning," he said. She didn't lower the peg. Her eyes were moving fast, taking in the room. The door, the window, the table, the shelf, the revolver on the mantel. She saw the revolver, and her whole body went rigid. Gideon followed her gaze to the gun. Then he looked back at her. He crossed to the mantel in 3 steps, picked up the Navy Colt by the barrel, and set it down on the far end of the mantel, grip facing away from both of them. Then he went back to where he'd been standing, against the wall, hands at his sides. "It's there," he said. "You can see it. I'm here. You can see me." He paused. "I'm not going to take anything from you." Clara's arm stayed up. Her wrist was trembling from holding the weight of the peg. She didn't seem to notice or didn't care. "Where's my coat?" she asked. "Drying rack behind you. To your left." She glanced. "It was there, my boots, beside the door. I got them dried out as best I could. The right sole's still split. You'd want to wrap it before you walk far." She looked at the door. She looked at him. "I'm not stopping you," he said. "If you want to go, you go. Temperature outside is about 10 degrees, and there's 3 feet of fresh drift between here and the tree line. But that's your call to make." A long silence. The fire was going strong. She could feel the heat of it against her back. She was wearing his flannel shirt and dry socks, and she was warm in a way she probably hadn't been in a while. From the look of her, when he'd brought her in, slowly the peg came down. She didn't put it down. She kept it loose in her hand, at her side. He didn't say anything about that. "Coffee's made," he said, and turned back to the stove. She didn't run. He hadn't expected her to, not in this cold with those boots, but he also hadn't been sure. He made 2 cups and left one on the edge of the table, nearest the hearth, where she could reach it without coming close to him. She took it eventually, stood by the fire, and drank it, and didn't say anything. He ate standing at the counter. Cornbread from yesterday warmed in the pan. He left a portion on a plate without pointing to it. She ate it. He went out to the barn for the morning feed and left her alone in the cabin for an hour. When he came back, she was sitting in the rocking chair with her knees pulled up, looking into the fire. The cedar peg was on the hearthstone beside her. She'd set it down. That was something. The days had a shape to them on this ranch, and he kept to the shape because it was what kept him sane. He wasn't good at empty time. Empty time let other things in. So he worked at the table with his survey maps, then at the window, repairing a broken rifle stock, then out to the woodpile and back. He worked, and he didn't talk much, and he didn't watch her. She watched him, though. He could feel it. Those careful eyes tracking his movements around the room, trying to work out the pattern, trying to understand what was expected of her. Around midday, she spoke. "What do you want me to do?" He looked up from the rifle stock. "In what sense?" "To earn my keep," she said it flatly. "Matter of fact, I can cook. I can mend. I can scrub floors. I can split wood if you give me an axe." She paused. "I'm stronger than I look." He studied her for a moment. She was serious. There was no self-pity in it, just practicality. A ledger book approach to being alive. Services rendered in exchange for shelter. She'd been doing that calculation her whole life, probably. "I don't need anything from you right now," he said. Her brow pulled together. "You've got to need something," she said. "Everyone needs something." "Sure, not from you. Not today." He set the rifle stock down. "You were half frozen solid less than 24 hours ago. You're allowed to sit by a fire for a day without producing anything." She stared at him. It was the stare of someone who had been told a thing they didn't have a category for. She blinked once, twice, then looked back at the fire. "That's not how it works," she said. Her voice had dropped. "On this ridge," he said, "it's exactly how it works." The afternoon brought clouds back across the peaks. Not another storm, just the ordinary gray lid of a February sky pressing down on the high country. The light went flat and colorless, and the cabin felt smaller with it. Gideon was at the table with his maps again when he heard her breathing change. He didn't look up immediately. He gave it a moment. The sound was particular, not crying, not quite, but that effortful silence of someone trying very hard not to cry, which was worse. The shaky inhale, the held breath, pause. He set down his pencil. Clara had her face turned toward the fire, and her arms wrapped around her own middle. The cedar peg was still on the hearthstone. Her shoulders were pulled in tight. He waited. When it came in a rush. Not loud. She was someone who'd learned to be quiet about pain. That was obvious. But it spilled out of her anyway, low and raw. "I'm a withered, barren branch," she said. To the fire, to no one. "That's what they called me. Cursed by God." Her voice was unsteady. 8 years of marriage and nothing to show for it. Nothing but labor and sin, they said. A woman who can't bring forth children has no purpose. That's scripture, they told me. That was the whole of what I was. Gideon put his hands flat on the table. "Fit only to work," she said. "That's all. That's all I was ever good for." Her voice was climbing despite herself. That tight, desperate pitch of someone who'd kept something bottled a long time. And when I couldn't even do that anymore, when my body just stopped, they said I was spent. They said I was done. My own father looked me in the face and said I was a burden too heavy to carry. She stopped, pressed her hand against her mouth. Gideon stood up. He walked to the hearth. He didn't sit. He just stood to her left, not close, facing the fire the same direction she was. "Stop," he said. She turned her head toward him. His voice was level, not hard, just certain. "What they told you is not the truth about you. Not one word of it." She shook her head, starting to turn away. "Clara." She stopped. He waited until she was looking at him again. "On this ridge, you don't owe anyone children or labor to earn the right to breathe. You're alive, and that is enough." The silence after that was long. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and something moved through her face, not relief. Not exactly. More like the expression of a person who has heard a sentence in a language they studied once, but never expected to hear spoken aloud. Unsteady, not quite believing. "You don't know what I am," she said. "I know what you're not," he said. "You're not what they called you." She looked back at the fire. He went back to the table. She cried after that, quietly, turned toward the hearth with her hand over her mouth. He didn't comment on it, didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for, didn't look over more than once to make sure she was all right. He just let her have it. Some things needed to come out, and the only way was through. After a while, the crying stopped. After another while, she asked him if she could have more coffee. "Help yourself," he said. Pot's on the stove," she did. That evening, she asked to help with supper. He'd been about to say no, then looked at her face and understood that she wasn't asking for his benefit. She needed to do something with her hands. He recognized that. He had the same need himself. "Beans need sorting," he said, "and there's a pot that needs scrubbing from yesterday." She sorted the beans at the table across from his maps, working through them with quick fingers, pulling out the shriveled ones, the split ones, lining them up in small groups. She scrubbed the pot without being asked twice. She moved around the kitchen end of the cabin with a quiet efficiency that said she'd been cooking in some form or another her whole life. He watched her, not staring, just the ordinary awareness of another person in a space he'd had to himself for years. It was strange. He kept expecting it to bother him more. It didn't. They ate. He talked some about the ranch, about the spring survey he was planning once the snow let up, about the roan heifer in the barn, who'd likely calve within the week. She listened and asked a question or two. Small questions, cautious. How many head did he run? How far was the nearest town? Jasper Crossing, he told her. 2 hours down the canyon in good weather. 5 in bad. There was a trading post, a mail station, a sheriff who mostly kept to himself. She filed that information away visibly. "Nobody from the valley comes up here much?" she asked. Creed's scouts do, he said. Timber Baron out of Denver. He wants my water deed, and he's been sending men up to remind me of that. He paused. Other than them, no. Road's too rough in winter, and there's nothing up here worth the climb. Except cattle. Except cattle, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Do they know where I am? She asked, carefully. Your people? She nodded. They'd have to know this ranch existed first, he said, and they'd have to get past the East Canyon Trail in 3 feet of fresh snow. He looked at her directly. Nobody's coming up here today. She let out a breath she'd been holding. Tomorrow, she asked. Tomorrow we'll deal with tomorrow, he said. The next morning, she was up before him. He came out of the back room to find her at the stove. Poking at the fire she'd stoked back up, the coffee pot already on. She'd found her coat on the drying rack and put it on over his flannel shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a rough braid. She looked up when he came in, quick and cautious, and then looked back at the stove. Figured I'd get the fire going, she said. Good, he said, and left it at that. He pulled on his coat and boots and went out to the barn. The roan heifer was standing in the corner of her stall, turned into the wall, her tail raised slightly. He checked her and felt the early signs, the relaxed musculature, the slight discharge. Tonight, maybe tomorrow, he'd have to stay close. When he came back, Clara had found the rest of the cornmeal and made a porridge of sorts. It was plain. She'd added a little dried fruit from the shelf and a pinch of the salt he kept in a crock by the stove. She'd set 2 bowls on the table. Hope that's all right, she said. It's more than all right, he said. He meant it. They ate together, and the silence had changed from the day before. Lighter. Not easy. Not yet, but less weighted with fear. She still tracked his movements when she thought he wasn't looking. She still kept herself near the door whenever she could. But she'd made porridge and set 2 bowls, and that was a kind of decision. After breakfast, he got out the ranch ledger. It was a battered leather-bound book, thick with his handwriting column after column of cattle counts, hay weights, water measurements, fence costs. He used it the way a ship's captain used a log. He sat with it open on the table and worked through the week's entries. Clara stood across the table, drying the bowls. She glanced at the ledger, then away, then back. That's numbers, she said. It is. I can't read numbers, she said. I can't read much of anything. She said it without shame, just the same flat, matter-of-fact honesty she'd used about cooking and mending. They didn't teach us. He looked up. Who didn't? The commune. She set the bowl down. Women weren't meant to read, only enough to follow the hymnal. Can you read the hymnal? He asked. Some, she said. Then you can learn to read anything. He turned the ledger around so it faced her and pushed it across the table. Come look. She looked at it from where she was standing. Come sit down, he said. I'm not going to bite you. She sat, perched at the edge of the bench, back straight, like someone waiting to be dismissed. She looked at the ledger the way she'd looked at the coffee that first morning, wanting it, and not quite trusting it. He pointed to the top of the column. That number is the date. This one is the head count. How many cattle I tallied that morning. This one is the weight of hay in pounds. He moved his finger slowly. This column on the right is the running cost. She followed his finger. That one doesn't add up, she said. He blinked. What? She pointed. That column. You've got 43, 39, 47, and then this one. Her finger stopped on a figure that one should be 41, but you wrote 44. He looked at the entry. He looked at it for a moment. She was right. He'd made a transposition error 3 weeks ago and hadn't caught it. You can count, he said. She shrugged, a small, careful shrug. I could always count. I ran the food stores for the whole East dormitory for 2 years, 40 women, and their children. She paused. I just did it in my head. Didn't know you could write it down like that. He looked at her. Yes, you can, he said. You absolutely can. That afternoon, he taught her. Not in a formal way, he wasn't a teacher, and he'd have been the first to say so. But he showed her how he tallied the cattle counts, how the columns worked, how the figures across a week told a story about whether the ranch was in balance or bleeding out. She sat beside him at the table with a stubby pencil in her hand and copied figures slowly at first, then with more confidence. She caught another error, then another. By mid-afternoon, she had 2 pages of practice tallies in front of her, shaky but legible, and she was staring at them with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something between bewilderment and something that might have been pride, if she'd been allowed to feel pride without it being knocked out of her. He got up to check the stove. "Gideon," she said. He turned. She was looking at the tally sheets. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Teaching me." She looked up. "You don't need me to read your ledger. You've been doing it yourself for years." He leaned against the counter and thought about how to answer that. "Because you're sharp," he said finally. "Sharper than anyone gave you credit for, from the sound of it. And things you can do don't disappear just because nobody trained you." He crossed his arms. "Also, on this ranch, anybody living here ought to be able to read the ledger. In case something happens to me." She blinked at that. "In case something happens to you," she repeated. "I'm a man living alone at high altitude with enemies below the canyon," he said. "It's a practical consideration." She looked at the tally sheets again. "All right," she said, and picked up the pencil. He checked the heifer twice more before dark. She was uncomfortable but not in distress. He left a lantern burning low in the barn and came back in and told Clara it would likely be overnight. "I'll stay up with her," he said. "I'll stay up too," Clara said. He opened his mouth. "I'm not useful asleep," she said before he could speak. "And I'm already awake, more than I'm not." He understood that. He had the same problem. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth through the early evening, him with a cup of coffee and his maps, her with the ledger and the pencil, working slowly through the practice tallies he'd set her. The fire popped and hissed. The wind outside was gentler tonight, just a low breath against the eaves. Around 9, she set down the pencil. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Your hands?" She was looking at her own, in her lap. "When you brought me in, she stopped. You were careful." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire worked quietly between them. "Because you were unconscious," he said, "and you were a stranger. And my job was to warm you up and get your clothes dry, not anything else." He paused. "There's only one way to do that right." She was quiet for a bit. "Where I came from," she said, slowly. "Men weren't careful." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. "I know that," he said after a moment. "I figured." She nodded once, looked back at the fire. "I haven't been." She stopped. Tried again. "I don't know what normal is. I don't know what it's supposed to look like." She said it quietly, not as a complaint, just as a fact. "I don't know if I'll ever know." He thought about that. "You've been here 2 days," he said. "Give it time." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite." "Close, you're patient," she said. "I've been told I am," he said. "By who mostly horses and cattle," he said. This time she did laugh. Barely. A small, surprised sound, bitten off quick as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to make it. But it was there he went back to his maps. She went back to the ledger. The fire burned down, and he built it back up, and around midnight, they both pulled on their coats and went out to the barn together, their boots crunching on the packed snow, their breath making twin clouds in the lantern light. The roan heifer was in the corner, sides heaving. "Tonight," Gideon said, and hung the lantern on the hook. Clara stood just inside the barn door and watched him cross to the heifer's stall. She watched him speak to the animal in that same low, unhurried voice he used for everything, his hand moving along her flank, steady and sure. He pulled fresh straw from the bale by the wall and spread it. He filled a bucket with warm water from the tank he kept heated by the small barn stove in the corner. He moved without rushing, without forcing, just present, ready. Clara stayed by the door. She wasn't sure what she was watching exactly. She'd seen animals born before, on the commune, It had always been loud, rough, practical, something to get through and move on from. Something functional. This was different. She couldn't have said exactly how, only that it was. The heifer labored and Gideon stayed, talking to her still. Nothing important, just words. The sound of them, steady and low. He didn't pace. He didn't show impatience. When the heifer went down at last, he was right there, guiding, careful, his big hands gentle in a way that still surprised Clara when she saw it. The calf came just after 2 in the morning. Small, wet, dark-coated, folded strange, and then suddenly not folded at all, suddenly a whole thing, landing in the fresh straw. Gideon was on his knees beside it immediately, clearing the membrane from its face, his fingers quick and sure. He pulled it toward the warmth of the small stove's reach and began working straw across its sides in long, brisk strokes. The calf shook its head. It made a sound, that thin, new sound that newly born things make, somewhere between a cough and a call. The heifer got up, turned, found her calf, and began to clean it with that slow, thorough attention that mothers had, human or otherwise. Gideon sat back on his heels in the straw. He let out a breath he'd been holding. Clara was standing 6 feet away now. She drifted forward without meaning to, and she was watching the heifer's long tongue working across the calf's dark coat, and she was watching Gideon's face, open and unguarded in the lantern light. He wasn't performing relief. He was just relieved, just glad. The simple, unguarded gladness of someone who'd worked to keep a small life in the world and done it. He warmed a little milk from the morning pail and sat in the straw beside the calf and offered it with a cupped hand. The calf nosed at his fingers, found the milk, worked its jaw clumsily. Gideon made a quiet sound of encouragement. Clara stepped into the golden reach of the lantern. She looked down at his face, tipped slightly toward the calf. His jaw was dark with stubble, his eyes quiet and warm, and he was talking in a murmur she couldn't make out the words of, something patient and constant. She had never seen anything like it. She had been told all her life what it meant to bring forth life. She knew the official version, the dutiful, grim, required version. The version that had nothing of this, in it nothing of this gentleness, this willingness to stay awake all night, speaking softly to a frightened creature, just to keep it calm. She looked at his hands, large, scarred hands, and warm milk cupped in them for a newborn calf. At 2 in the morning, she looked at his face. She looked at the mother, her calf, the straw, the lantern light, and she asked the only question that came to her, with all the pure and unvarnished innocence of someone for whom the asking was entirely honest. So we make children this way? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Can I try too? The lantern flame wavered. Gideon went very still. She saw it happen, saw the change move through him like a current not visible in any one thing, but in everything at once. His shoulders, his hands, the slight tightening of his jaw, his eyes, when they came up to find her face, were different than they'd been a moment before. Darker, more careful, and filled with something she didn't have a word for. He looked at her for one long moment, and Gideon Shaw, who had walked through battles without flinching, who had held a perimeter line alone, through a night ambush without making a sound, who had built this ranch with his own 2 hands on the side of a mountain and held it against men with money and legal tricks and hired guns. Gideon Shaw trembled. Just once. Just slightly. His jaw moved. His hand tightened for a second around the milk cup. He turned away, faced the calf, the straw. The mother cleared his throat, once quietly. He didn't answer her. Not directly. Not with words. He just sat there in the straw for a moment, head slightly down, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but lower than it had been. She'll need to nurse on her own in an hour, he said. About the calf. We should wait and make sure she latches. Clara stood in the lantern light. She didn't know exactly what had just happened. She only knew that something had, and that whatever it was, it had moved through him the same way the cold had moved through her against that drift fence. Deep and total. She sat down in the straw on the other side of the calf. They waited together. The calf breathed. The heifer breathed. The lantern burned. Outside, the mountain held its cold breath over everything, and the stars above the Sangre de Cristo range were sharp and thick and very far away. March came in mean. It always did, up here. The valley below might have been turning. The creek ice going soft at the edges. The first mud showing on the south-facing slopes. But High Pass didn't know about any of that. High Pass got another 2 feet of snow in the first week of March, and temperatures that dropped back to single digits at night, and a wind that came off the Continental Divide like it had a score to settle. Clara had been on the ranch for 3 weeks. She knew this because she'd started marking it. Not on paper, just in her head. A quiet tally she kept, without quite deciding to. 3 weeks since the drift fence. 3 weeks since she'd woken up in a strange cabin with a cedar peg in her hand. 3 weeks since anyone had told her to do something and meant it as a command rather than an instruction she'd chosen to follow. The difference was everything. She'd started to find the shape of the days. Up before full light, fire-stoked, coffee made. Gideon would come in from the barn, with cold air clinging to his coat, and they'd eat together in the easy quiet they'd settled into, the kind that didn't require filling. After breakfast, she'd work through the ledger entries he'd started leaving for her, a week's worth of tallies. She was meant to check and recopy in her own hand. Her writing was improving. She could see it, improving, which was a strange and good feeling, watching herself get better at something. Afternoons, she spent wherever she could be useful. She'd taken over the indoor cooking entirely, not because he'd asked her to, but because it gave her an hour of purposeful work each day, and she was starting to understand that purposeful work was one of the things keeping her upright. She mended a split seam in his spare canvas coat. She organized the root cellar by type and date, something that had clearly never been done. She found a loose board in the porch and pointed it out, and he fixed it that same afternoon. He never told her to do any of it. He also never told her not to. That was the thing she kept returning to, in the quiet moments. He managed the entire ranch without once issuing an order to her. He'd say what he was planning to do, or what needed doing, and leave it there. Whether she joined or not was her business. She'd started joining. Mostly, the cedar peg was still by the hearth. She'd never moved it. The roan heifer's calf was doing well. Clara had started going to the barn in the mornings with Gideon, which had begun as curiosity and become habit. She'd learned the cattle by their markings. She could tell the 2 gray steers apart now. One had a notch in his left ear from an old wire cut, and the other had a whiter patch across his nose. She'd named them in her head, though she hadn't told Gideon that. The roan's calf she'd named Spark, also only in her head. Spark was 3 weeks old now and already getting bold, nosing into corners of the stall, kicking up small, surprised jumps at his own shadow. She watched him in the mornings with something that felt like warmth, or maybe just the absence of its opposite. That was March on the ranch. Then, on the first Thursday of the month, she'd started keeping track of days, too. Using the almanac, Gideon kept on the shelf. The weather turned truly bad. Not a blizzard, worse than a blizzard in some ways. A sustained cold snap that pressed down over the high country and stayed, temperatures dropping to 15 below zero at night and barely crawling above zero in the afternoon. The kind of cold that was dangerous for cattle, especially the younger animals, and any heifer close to calving. And Gideon had 2 more heifers due. He started sleeping in the barn, or trying to. He'd built a small sleeping platform in the loft years ago for exactly this situation, a rough bunk with a tick mattress and a pile of wool blankets. He'd go out after supper and be there through the night and come back in at dawn for coffee and a few hours of sleep before going out again. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. He started moving with that particular economy of motion that exhausted people develop, where every gesture is exactly what's needed and nothing more. Clara watched this and said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, she brought his supper to the barn. He was in the loft when she came in, sitting up in the bunk with his back against the wall, maps spread across his knees. He looked up at the sound of the barn door, and his expression didn't change, but she thought she saw something shift in his eyes when he registered what she was carrying. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She set the plate on the rail at the base of the loft ladder. He climbed down and sat on a hay bale and ate it while she checked the water trough. She'd learned to break the ice correctly, one sharp blow with the flat heel of the axe just left of center, where the ice was thinnest at this time of year. She did it, and the water opened up, and she moved through to the next stall. He watched her do this without comment. "Temperature's going to break by the weekend," he said. "Miller at the trading post sends a rider up with the weather report, first Friday of every month. He came yesterday, said it's turning." "Good," she said. "The second heifer's showing signs. I think she'll calve Saturday." "I'll stay up," Clara said. She was talking to the water trough, not looking at him. "Clara, I'm not useful asleep," she said. "We've been through this." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite argument. She moved on to Sparks' stall and checked that his water was clean. "You named him," Gideon said behind her. She went still. "I haven't named any of them," she said carefully. "You call that one Spark," he said. "I've heard you. You think you're quiet, but you're not in here." She turned around. He was looking at her with a perfectly straight face over the edge of his supper plate. "It suits him," she said. "It does," Gideon agreed, and went back to his food. The second heifer calved on Friday, not Saturday, a compact, light-colored bull calf that came fast, and without too much trouble. Clara was there for it. She sat in the straw against the opposite wall and watched Gideon work and said nothing, because talking wasn't what was needed. But she stayed. The third heifer, an older cow named Bridge, Gideon's name, not hers, was slower. Bridge had calved twice before, and she was experienced and not particularly anxious about it. But she was large, and the weather was pushing cold into the barn, despite the stove, and Gideon was concerned about hypothermia in a newborn. He'd built up the barn stove to its hottest in the back corner of Bridge's stall. He'd put down double the usual straw. He'd checked her 3 times since supper. By 10 o'clock, it was clear it was going to be a long night. Clara brought the lantern closer to Bridge's stall and sat down in the straw outside it, her back against the post, her coat pulled around her. She had the almanac in her lap. She'd started reading it in the evenings, slowly sounding out the harder words to herself, but she wasn't reading now. She was watching Bridge. Gideon was in the stall with the cow, moving around her in slow circles, one hand often resting on her side, not pushing, not directing, just present. Bridge made low sounds periodically, deep and rhythmic, and Gideon would respond each time with a few words, or just a murmur, his hand moving in a long stroke down her flank. Clara watched this for a long time. She'd grown up around animals. The commune kept livestock chickens, goats, 3 bad-tempered mules, and a handful of dairy cows. The men handled the larger animals, and the work was considered purely functional. You fed them enough to keep them producing, you got out of the pen, you moved on. She'd never seen anyone talk to a cow the way Gideon talked to Bridge. Not with words of any importance, just the sound, the ongoing proof of presence. Bridge went down around 11. Clara set down the almanac. Gideon was there in the straw with the cow, one knee down, speaking in that low, continuous way. The labor was harder than the first 2 had been. Bridge was straining, and the calf was large, and it was taking time. Gideon worked with patience and with his hands, careful and sure, not forcing anything, just helping where helping was needed, and stepping back when it wasn't. An hour passed. Clara hadn't moved from her spot outside the stall. She'd pulled her knees up, and her chin was on her arms, and she was watching everything Bridge's sides heaving. Gideon's hands, the lamplight moving across both of them. At midnight, the calf came. Big, dark, like its mother. It hit the straw, and Gideon caught it, or helped it down, and then he was clearing the face and pulling straw around it, and this time the calf was slow to respond. It lay still for a moment that went on too long. Gideon put both hands against the calf's sides and pressed a firm, rhythmic motion. He leaned down and spoke directly to it. Actual words this time. Clara couldn't hear them from where she was, but his mouth was moving. The calf took a breath. A shudder ran through it. Its head lifted. It made the thin, new sound. Gideon sat back in the straw. He let out a long, slow breath of his own. His shoulders dropped an inch. His head tipped forward for just a second, just enough to say he'd been carrying something and was setting it down. He reached for the warm milk pail and moved the calf toward the heat of the stove with careful hands, and he cupped milk in his palm and waited. Bridge had gotten to her feet. She turned and came to her calf and began slowly to wash it with her tongue. The calf pushed back against its mother's weight. Gideon sat beside it in the straw with the milk cupped in his hand, patient, not hurrying. Clara stood up. She moved to the stall gate without quite deciding to, drawn forward by something she didn't have a name for. She unlatched the gate quietly and stepped in. The straw was warm and deep against her boots. Bridge looked at her with slow, calm eyes and went back to her calf. Clara stood and looked at the three of them, the cow, the calf, the man in the lamplight. She looked at his hands, big hands, calloused, with a white scar across the back of the right one she'd noticed before, holding warm milk for a newborn in the middle of a freezing night. His face was tired and unguarded, angled down toward the calf, and there was a quality to his expression she hadn't seen on a man's face before. She searched for what to call it. Tenderness, maybe. The uncomplicated kind. Or something simpler than that. Just caring. Just genuine caring. For a small creature that couldn't speak, or explain itself, or offer anything in return. She'd been told her whole life what it meant to create life. She'd been given the version that was duty and obligation, grim and mechanical, something that happened to women and was endured, and then produced a result that was the real point. The woman in that version was just the container. The process had nothing to do with warmth, or patience, or sitting up all night, in frozen straw, talking softly to a frightened animal. She looked at his hands again. She looked at his face. She stepped into the golden reach of the lantern light and looked up at him, and the question came out of her with complete and honest simplicity, the same way it had the first time, 3 weeks ago, when the roan calf was new in the world, and she hadn't yet found a way to think about the things she didn't know. "So we make children this way?" she asked. "Can I try too?" The lantern didn't waver this time. There was no wind to move it. But Gideon went still. She saw it happen the same way it had happened before. But this time she was closer and the light was better, and she could see it more clearly. It started in his hands, that slight, involuntary tightening. Then his jaw, a slow clench and release. Then something moved through his whole frame, a single current running from his shoulders down. And his eyes came up to find her face. He trembled, not like a man afraid, nothing like that. Something else entirely, something that came from a depth she couldn't measure and passed through him and left his face entirely open for one unguarded moment. He looked at her. She looked back. The calf made a small sound between them. Gideon cleared his throat. Once, he turned his head away from her, back to the calf, his eyes dropping. His hand moved against the calf's side in that long, stroking motion, steadying himself or steadying the calf or both. He didn't answer her, not with words. Clara stood in the straw and watched his profile in the lamplight, the straight line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the absolute careful stillness he'd pulled back around himself like a coat. And she understood, without knowing quite how she understood, that what had just passed across his face was not something she'd put there by mistake. She didn't say anything else. She sat down in the straw on the other side of the calf and tucked her coat around her and watched Bridge wash her newborn and said nothing more that night. Morning came gray and still. The temperature had already begun to lift, the way Miller's report had promised. By the time Clara woke, she'd slept in the straw, which she hadn't meant to do. The barn had a different quality to it. Less siege. the cold still present but losing its authority. Gideon was at the barn stove with the coffee pot, which he'd apparently carried out from the cabin at some point. He handed her a cup when she sat up. She took it without comment. They drank coffee in Bridge's stall, and the new calf slept in the warm straw, and Bridge stood over it with that absolute bovine certainty of new mothers. "I want to ask you something," Clara said. Gideon looked at her over his cup when I asked that question, she said. "The first time in February," she paused, "and then again last night." He waited. "You always," she stopped. "You turn away." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, actually thinking about it. "Because you deserve to ask it in safety," he said. "And answering it wrong, or answering it in the wrong moment, isn't safe for you." He looked at the calf. "What you're asking comes from a real place, an honest place. And honest questions deserve honest answers, not whatever the nearest man thinks he's owed." Clara held her cup in both hands. "What's the honest answer?" she said. He looked at her. "The honest answer," he said slowly, "is that children come from choice, from two people choosing each other freely, with full knowledge and no obligation attached." He paused. "Not from transaction, not from duty, and not from anything that looks like what was done to you." She was quiet for a moment. "Martha Gable would tell you more than I can," he said. "She's the midwife down in the valley. She knows more about bodies and how they work than any church elder I've ever met. And she tells the truth about it. You think she'd talk to me?" "I think she'd be glad to," he said. Clara looked at the calf sleeping in the straw, breathing in that easy whole-body way that new things breathed. "All right," she said. He nodded. Finished his coffee. "Spring thaw opened the lower trail in a few weeks," he said. "We'll go down then. We'll go down. Not you can go down. Not I'll take you down." She noticed that she didn't say so. The cold broke that afternoon. Not warmth, not yet, not at this altitude. But the particular siege quality lifted. The sky went from white to a pale, watery blue, and the light came back into the valley below. Clara stood on the porch after lunch and looked out at it. The snowfields still blinding, but somehow different. Something in the angle of the light suggesting that things on the other side of this existed. Spring, eventually. She'd believed, when she ran, that she was running toward nothing. Just away. The away was the point. The destination, irrelevant. She hadn't thought past the away, because past the away felt like hubris. Felt like tempting something. She was starting to think past it now. She didn't know what to do with that. She went back inside and sat at the table with the ledger and worked through the week's entries. Her handwriting filled 3 pages. She found an error on the second page, her own error, a transposed figure, and corrected it neatly and moved on. Gideon came in from the barn around 4. He pulled off his coat and gloves and stood at the basin, washing his hands, and looked at the table. "You've been at it all afternoon," he said. "I want to get through the winter entries," she said. "The whole winter?" "The numbers aren't consistent after the first week of January. I think there's a systematic error somewhere in the hay weight column." She turned the ledger to show him. "See here, and then again here, the total at the bottom of each week is off by the same margin." He came and looked. He stood beside her at the table and looked at what she was pointing at, and she watched his face as he followed the column down. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "It's the conversion," she said. "You're multiplying by 14 when I think it should be 12. The bale weight changed when you switched suppliers in November, and the formula..." "Didn't." He straightened up and looked at her. She looked back at him, uncertain suddenly. "Is that wrong?" "No," he said. "That's exactly right." He shook his head slowly. "I've been off on the hay costs for 4 months. "I can fix it," she said, "if you tell me the right number." 12, he said. "You said 12. Then I'll recalculate." He pulled out the other chair and sat across from her at the table. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "You have a genuinely good mind," he said. "I want you to know that I see that." She looked at the ledger. She didn't know what to do with that statement. It sat in the air between them, and she turned it over and tried to find where it fit and couldn't, because no arrangement of the furniture in her head had a place for it. "It's just numbers," she said. "It's not just numbers," he said. "You spotted a systematic error across 4 months of records in one afternoon. That's not nothing." She kept looking at the ledger. After a moment, she picked up the pencil. "I'll have the corrected figures done by supper," she said. He was quiet for a second. "All right," he said, and stood up. She started at the top of the January column and worked down, methodical and careful, her pencil moving in steady lines. She could feel him at the stove behind her, starting supper. The ordinary sounds of the cabin in the late afternoon. The fire. The wind outside, quieter now. Spark in the barn probably making his surprised little jumps at shadows. She wrote the numbers down, one by one, and they added up correctly, and she kept going. March moved toward its end. The snow on the south-facing meadow slopes began to show dark patches where the ground was pushing through. The creek below the canyon sounded different, fuller, more alive. Gideon pointed it out one morning, standing on the porch, and she'd listened and heard it. That low, eager, rushing sound. She started going out onto the porch in the evenings. Not for any particular reason. Just to stand in the cold air and look at the mountains and the valley below and the enormous dark sky, which up here, at this altitude, away from any town, was something she had no frame of reference for. The stars were different than anywhere she'd ever been. More of them, more present. She'd been told, growing up, that the sky was God looking down. A watching sky, a judging sky. She stood on the porch on the last Thursday of March and looked up at it and found it didn't fit any on. And found it didn't fit anymore. It was just the sky. Vast and cold and indifferent and completely, unutterably beautiful. She could look at it straight on. Gideon came out on the porch one evening and found her looking up, and he stood beside her and looked up too. And they stood like that for a while in the cold without talking. "What do you see?" she asked. He thought about it. "Just what's there," he said. She nodded. Just what was there. She was starting to think she could learn to see that way. Just what was there, not what she'd been told was there. The sky and the mountains and the numbers in the ledger, and a man who sat up all night in frozen straw, talking softly to frightened animals. Just what was there. She went inside and banked the fire for the night. Tomorrow she'd finish the January corrections and start on February. The trail to the valley would open in a few weeks. Martha Gable would tell her things she didn't know yet. Things she was beginning to understand she had a right to know. She pulled the blanket up and listened to the mountain settle into its nighttime sounds and felt for the first time in longer than she could account for. Something she could almost call anticipation. Not hope. She wasn't ready to call it that yet. But its neighbor. Its close, quiet neighbor. That was enough for March. The trail opened on the second Saturday of April. Gideon walked it first, alone, early in the morning, before Clara was fully awake. He came back 2 hours later, with mud on his boots up to the knee, and reported that the lower canyon was passable. Barely, and the creek crossing at the halfway point was running fast but shallow enough to ford without a horse going under. He said it plainly. The way he said most things, standing at the basin washing the mud off while Clara stood at the stove. "We can go Tuesday," he said. "Give the trail 2 more days to firm up." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "Martha Gable." "Martha Gable," he confirmed. She turned back to the stove. She'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks, since the morning in the barn after Bridges' calf was born. When he'd first said the name, she'd turned it over in her mind while she worked through the ledger entries, while she stood on the porch, looking at the night sky, while she lay awake in the dark, listening to the mountain breathe. Martha Gable, a woman who knew things and told the truth about them. She'd been told things her whole life by people who claimed to know. The elders of the commune, her father, her husband, all of them speaking with absolute certainty about her body, her purpose, her failures. Apes of certainty delivered by people who, she was beginning to understand, had been wrong about most of it. The idea that someone might tell her something true about herself, not assign meaning to her, not explain what she was for, was so new it still made her a little lightheaded when she thought about it directly. Tuesday, she thought. She could wait until Tuesday. Monday, she was useless. She worked through the ledger and made 3 errors she had to correct twice, which hadn't happened in weeks. She burned the cornbread at lunch, which also hadn't happened. She stood on the porch for 20 minutes in the cold, without her coat, before realizing she'd forgotten to put it on. Gideon didn't comment on any of it. He was out on the fence line most of the day, checking the winter damage to the western perimeter. He came in at dusk with a report of 8 posts that needed resetting and a stretch of wire that had snapped in the cold and was coiled in the snow like a sleeping snake. He ate supper and talked about the fence, work with the same even practicality he brought to everything. And Clara listened and answered when he asked her things and was grateful for the ordinary conversation, because it gave her hands somewhere to be. After supper, she said, "What's she like?" He was cleaning his rifle at the table. He didn't ask who honest, he said. "She doesn't pretty things up, and she doesn't frighten you with them either. She just tells you what's true." He ran the cloth down the barrel. "She's been delivering babies and patching people up in this valley for 30 years. She knows more about how bodies work than most doctors I've encountered, and she's kinder about it than any of them." Clara was quiet. "She's not going to tell you anything that'll hurt you," he said, "not on purpose." "What if the truth hurts?" Clara asked. He looked up from the rifle. "Then she'll give it to you gently," he said, "and she won't leave you alone with it." Clara nodded. She went to bed early and lay in the dark and listened to the creek below the canyon, fuller now, running with snowmelt, and eventually she slept. They left before first light on Tuesday. Gideon saddled his bay, gelding a steady, thick-necked horse named Cabot that Clara had been making friends with over the past month, learning to read his moods by the set of his ears, and helped Clara up first, then swung up behind her. There was no second horse. He'd explained this practically. Cabot was the only animal he trusted completely on a wet canyon trail, and 2 riders on a reliable horse was safer than 2 riders on 1 reliable horse and 1 unknown. She'd agreed. She'd been on horses her whole life, but not horses she'd chosen to be on, so sitting up on Cabot's broad back felt different than she expected. Not frightening, just high. Gideon was at her back, close enough that she could feel the solid weight of him without it being uncomfortable. His arms came around to the reins on either side of her. She held the saddle horn with both hands at first, and then, after the trail leveled out past the first switchback, let go of it. The canyon was a different world in April. All winter she'd seen the upper ranch, the barn, the perimeter fences, the dark tree line at the edge of the south meadow. Now the canyon opened below them in stages as they descended, the trail switching back and forth across the slope. And with each level the air changed. Warmer, heavier, the smell of wet earth and pine sap, and the cold mineral smell of the creek running strong 30 feet below them. Bird song. She heard it before she registered what it was: a single bird, high up in a pine, and then 2 more, and by the time they reached the halfway crossing, the air was full of it. She hadn't heard birds in months. "Listen," she said. "First week of April," Gideon said, at her shoulder. "They come back from the south. Where do they go? Mexico. Some of them, Central America. Further, for some species." She looked up into the pines as Cabot stepped carefully into the creek. The water came up past his fetlocks, and he didn't like it, but he went. On the far bank, he shook himself and kept walking. "They always come back?" she asked. "Every year," he said. She didn't say anything else. She watched the canyon walls open up around them as they descended, the sky widening overhead from a narrow strip to something broader, and the trees changed from the high country spruce and fir to lower aspen stands, their white trunks vivid against the dark mud of the trail, the first green showing at their tips, pale as new paper. She'd never noticed aspen in April before. Or maybe she had, and there'd been too much noise in her head to register it. Martha Gable's homestead sat at the valley's edge, where the canyon flattened into meadow. It was a solid, well-built cabin, larger than Gideon's, with a proper covered porch running its full length and a garden plot beside it. Still mostly bare, but with beds that had been tended and turned and were waiting. A smokehouse stood behind the cabin, and a small outbuilding that Clara would later learn was where Martha did her medical work deliveries. Wound care, the setting of bones. A woman came out of the cabin before they'd reached the gate. She was somewhere in her 60s, or maybe her 50s, it was hard to say, because she had the particular agelessness of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and had made some fundamental peace with how they looked. Silver hair, mostly, pulled back without vanity, a plain work dress and a canvas apron. She was wiping her hands on a rag as she came down the porch steps, and when she saw Clara, she didn't change her expression into anything special. Just looked openly and calmly, the way you looked at someone you intended to be honest with. Gideon Shaw, she said. You're early in the season. Trail opened, he said, swinging down from Cabot. He helped Clara down. Martha, this is Clara. Clara, Martha said. She looked at her directly. Not up and down, not assessing in that performing way, just looked at her face. Come inside. Coffee's on. The inside of Martha's cabin was like the outside, solid and functional. But there were also books. More books than Clara had seen in one place in her life. Stacked on shelves, stacked on the table, stacked in piles on the floor, beside a reading chair. Medical texts Clara would eventually understand, though she couldn't read the spines well enough yet to know that. Herbals, almanacs, journals in hand-cracked leather covers. Martha poured 3 cups and sat at the table and folded her hands. Gideon took his cup and said, I'll go check on the fence situation down at Miller's Crossing. Give you 2 time. He said it to both of them, but he looked at Clara when he said it. She nodded once. He went. Martha watched him go and then looked back at Clara with the same open, calm expression. He's a decent man, she said. Not as an endorsement, more like she was giving Clara a piece of information she might need. I know, Clara said. What brings you down the mountain? Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She'd rehearsed this in the nights before Tuesday. She'd thought about how to explain it, what words to use, how much to say. She said all of it. It came out slower than she'd expected, and quieter, but she said it. The commune, the marriage at 16, the years of labor, and the expectation and the violence, and the way her body had eventually simply stopped bleeding, stopped responding, stopped feeling like something that belonged to her. She said what they'd told her, the elders, her husband, her own father. Barren, cursed, withered, a branch past bearing. Martha listened. She didn't make sounds of sympathy while Clara talked. She didn't lean forward and put her hand over Clara's or do anything that would have broken the thread. She just listened, her hands folded on the table, her eyes steady. When Clara finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How old are you? 24. And how long has it been since your last cycle? I don't know exactly. It stopped, went irregular within a year of the marriage. Then it stopped altogether. Maybe 2 years ago. Maybe 3. Martha nodded. She stood up and went to the medical room without saying anything else, and Clara heard the sound of things being moved around, pulled from shelves. She came back with a plain cloth bag and set it on the table. I want to examine you, Martha said, with your permission. Nothing I do will hurt you, and you can stop me at any point. Clara looked at the bag. What will you find? She asked. I don't know yet, Martha said. That's why I want to look. Clara thought about that. All right, she said. The examination took half an hour. Martha worked the way Gideon worked, without ceremony, without fuss, explaining each thing she was about to do before she did it. Her hands were warm and sure, and she narrated as she went. Not in a frightening way, but in the way of someone who believed that a person had the right to know exactly what was happening to their own body. She checked Clara's eyes, her gums, the skin of her inner arms and the backs of her hands. She pressed gently on the sides of her throat, her abdomen, the soft tissue under her jaw. She asked about headaches, about sleep, about what she'd been eating and how much. When she was done, she sat back and looked at Clara for a moment. "You want me to tell you plainly," she said. "It wasn't a question, yes," Clara said. Martha nodded. She folded her hands in her lap. "You are not barren," she said. "There is nothing wrong with your body that was put there by God or nature. What happened to you was put there by people and by circumstance, and almost all of it can be undone." Clara went very still. "The absence of your cycle is called amenorrhea," Martha continued. "It's a condition, not a judgment. Your body stopped that particular function because it didn't have enough resources to maintain it. You were malnourished for years. I can see it in your gums, in the quality of your hair, in the tissue of your skin. Your body made a choice, the way bodies do. It redirected everything it had to keeping you alive at the most basic level. Reproduction is expensive. Physically, when a body is starving or under constant physical stress, it shuts that system down first." Clara was staring at her hands on the table. "That's what happened," Martha said. "Your body protected you the only way it could." "Then why did they say?" "Because they didn't know," Martha said. "Or they didn't want to know. It was more convenient for them to call you broken than to look at what they were doing to you." She paused. "Your body is not broken, Clara. It is healing, and given proper food, rest, and safety, which from what Gideon tells me you are beginning to have, it will continue to heal." Clara looked at her own hands. She turned them over. Looked at the palms, the fingers, the faded calluses from years of work. "It will come back?" she asked. "Your cycle?" "Yes, very likely," Martha said. "It may take months. It may be irregular at first. But yes, very likely." She leaned forward slightly. "Clara, your body is your own country. No church and no man has the right to cross its borders without your welcome. Whatever happens inside it, whatever it does or doesn't do, that is yours. Not your father's, not your husband's, not any elder's, yours." The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird was singing in the aspen stand behind the cabin. Clara looked at Martha Gable's face, the clear, steady eyes, the absolute absence of cruelty or agenda, and felt something give way in her chest, slowly, like ice going out of a river. Not dramatic, just the gradual release of something that had been frozen a long time. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry, quite, or she did, but only a little, and Martha didn't make a production of it. She poured more coffee and set a plate of dried apricots on the table and waited. "You'll want to eat more," Martha said when Clara had steadied. "Red meat, when Gideon has it. Beans and lentils. Eggs, if you can get them. Whatever green things come up in the garden in summer." She opened the cloth bag and took out 3 small paper packets, each tied with twine. "This is nettle. This is red clover. This is ashwagandha root. You steep them in hot water for 10 minutes and drink a cup each morning." She lined them up on the table. "They support the body's recovery. Nothing miraculous. Just what the body needs when it's rebuilding itself." Clara reached out and touched the first packet. "I need to read the labels," she said. "Gideon tells me you're learning." "I am. I'll write them out in large letters," Martha said. "And I'll show you what each plant looks like, so you can identify them yourself." She stood up. "Come outside." They spent another hour in Martha's garden. Martha crouched in the soft spring earth and turned it with her hands and showed Clara things, the early leaves of stinging nettle, coming up along the garden's fence line, silvery and small, but unmistakable. The red clover she'd planted deliberately in the far corner. She told Clara how to harvest them, when to pick, how to dry them, on a clean cloth in a shaded spot. Clara crouched beside her and watched and listened. She asked questions she'd never been allowed to ask, about how the body worked, specifically, and in plain language, how the cycle functioned, and what it meant, and what its absence meant. Martha answered all of it, without hesitation, and without making it strange. She used plain words, correct words, And she didn't apologize for them or dress them up. She told Clara about how conception actually worked, not the commune's version, which had been vague and commanded and overlaid with sin. The actual biological sequence explained simply and without shame what the body did and when and why. She talked about it the way she'd talk about any natural process, because that's what it was. Clara listened to all of it. She filed it away carefully, the way she filed numbers in the ledger, fact by fact, true thing by true thing. When Gideon came back around noon, leading Cabot and carrying a wrapped parcel from the trading post in his other hand, he found them both in the garden. Martha was on her knees turning a bed of earth. Clara was standing at the fence line, with a small nettle leaf pinched between her fingers, holding it up to the light and studying it. He stopped at the gate. Clara turned and saw him. She looked different standing there. He wasn't sure he could have said how, exactly. Same coat, same dark hair, same careful eyes. But something in the set of her shoulders was different. Something in the way she was standing in that garden, holding that leaf up to the light, had a quality that hadn't been there before. Like someone who had just been told they were standing on solid ground and had set their full weight down for the first time. Martha got to her feet and brushed the dirt from her apron. "Your woman's all right," she said to Gideon. "She's not He started. "She's all right," Martha repeated, with a slight emphasis that ended the other sentence. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. She held up the nettle leaf. "Stinging nettle," she said, "urtica, dioica, high in iron and calcium. I have to pick it with gloves, or it raises welts." She paused. "Martha says there are stands of it along the creek bank above your cabin." "There are," he said. "I'll find them in the summer." He nodded. She turned back to study the leaf. They ate lunch at Martha's table. Salt pork and boiled potatoes, and the first early onion greens that had come up in the garden, dressed with vinegar. Clara ate steadily, and without the self-consciousness she'd had at the start, back in February, when she'd eaten like someone half expecting the plate to be taken away. Martha watched her eat and said nothing, but looked satisfied. After lunch, Martha packed a cloth sack with the 3 paper herb packets, 2 jars of preserved blackberries from her cellar, a small wedge of hard cheese, and a pamphlet she'd ordered from Denver. Printed on rough paper and titled in plain block letters, "The Working Woman's Guide to Her Own Body." She put it on top of the jars. Clara looked at it. "It uses simple words," Martha said. "Short sentences. You should be able to read most of it within a month, given how fast Gideon says you're progressing." Clara picked it up, looked at the cover, turned it over and looked at the back, which had dense small text she couldn't read yet, but would. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it the way you meant it when someone gave you something fundamental. Martha looked at her squarely. "You are 24 years old," she said. "You have a body that is healing itself. You have a good mind and hands that know how to work. Whatever anyone told you about what you were, or what you were worth." She paused. They were describing their own limitations, not yours. Clara held the pamphlet against her chest. "I'm starting to think that might be true," she said. "It is true," Martha said. "Hold on to starting to. It'll get to is true on its own." The ride back up the canyon was slower because the trail was softer in the afternoon heat, and Cabot had to pick his footing more carefully. The sun was moving west behind the peaks by the time they started climbing, and the canyon filled with long blue shadows and the sound of the creek below them. Clara held the cloth sack in her lap. The pamphlet was inside it. She'd been quiet since they left Martha's gate, but it was a different quiet than the silence she'd carried down the mountain in February. Fuller, like a quiet that had things in it, rather than one that existed because there was nothing safe to put there. "She told you about the amenorrhea," Gideon said, behind her. "Not a question. She told me everything," Clara said. "She told me what it was and what caused it, and that it wasn't permanent." She paused. "She told me it was from the malnutrition and the stress, that my body shut it down to preserve itself." "She's right," he said. "Did you know?" "Before she told me." He was quiet for a moment. Cabot stepped over a root in the trail. I suspected something like that, he said. I've seen animals do the same thing in bad winters. Their bodies stop certain functions when there isn't enough to maintain everything. He paused. It made sense to me that a human body would do the same. Clara thought about that. You thought I might not be barren, she said. I thought what they told you might not be the truth, he said. I didn't know Martha knows. She said it'll come back. Cyclical. Probably. With food and rest and time. It's good news, he said. It is. She watched a hawk tilting above the canyon, riding a thermal. It's the first good news anyone's given me about my own body in 8 years. She paused. Maybe ever. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He just let it be true in the air between them, which was its own kind of answer. They climbed in silence for a while. The trail steepened above the aspen line, and the spruce came back around them, darker, and the temperature dropped. She could see the high peaks now, still white, still vast, the snow on them catching the last of the afternoon light and going gold. She said a thing, Clara said. Martha, what thing? She said. Clara stopped, said it again from the beginning. She said that my body is my own country, that no church and no man has the right to cross its borders without my welcome. He was quiet for a moment behind her. She's right, he said. I've never thought of it that way, Clara said. My body as something that belongs to me. She looked at the mountains ahead of them, the peaks going gold and then rose. I've thought of it as something that belonged to everyone else and was failing at its job. It wasn't failing, he said. I know that now. She held the sack a little tighter in her lap. Martha told me. The trail leveled briefly at the halfway crossing, the creek running fast and silver below them, and Cabot stepped into it without hesitation this time. The water was cold enough that she could feel it through her boots. On the far bank he shook and climbed, and the canyon above them deepened toward evening. She could see the light on the upper ridge, the high country. Home. She held onto that word for a second, turned it over. Then she let it sit. She was better that week. Not dramatically. Not the way things changed in stories, all at once and visible, but in the particular, daily way that real things changed one meal at a time, one morning at a time, one page of the ledger at a time. She drank the nettle tea each morning, steeped carefully for 10 minutes the way Martha had shown her, and it tasted like grass, and she drank it anyway. She read 3 pages of the pamphlet each evening by firelight. Slowly, with Gideon across the table, if she wanted to ask about a word. She asked about a lot of words. He answered all of them plainly, without making it awkward. The color in her face changed over the weeks. Gideon noticed it, but didn't say so, because she wasn't something to be commented on like a garden recovering from frost. He just noticed. The gray tiredness under her skin gave way to something warmer. She started losing the careful hunger around her eyes, that watchfulness of a person who was always checking to see if the thing they had would be taken away. She laughed more. Not a lot, but more than before, and when she laughed, it came out the whole way instead of being bitten off at the beginning. She got to the halfway point of the pamphlet by the end of April. She read a sentence aloud to him one evening without planning to. She'd been sitting by the fire, and he'd been at the table, and she'd read a line that stopped her, and she said it out loud before she'd decided to. A woman who understands her own body is not a danger to society. She is a fully formed human being, and a fully formed human being is the foundation of a healthy civilization. She looked up. He was looking at her from the table. That's from the introduction, she said. I know, he said. Did you read it? Martha gave me a copy 2 years ago, he said. For situations like this. She looked at the pamphlet in her hands. She's done this before, Clara said. Helped women like me. Yes, he said. This valley has had more than one woman come through it that needed what Martha could give. He paused. That's why she lives at the edge of it. So she's findable. Clara looked back at the page. Fully formed human being. She read the sentence again quietly to herself. Then she turned the page and kept reading. The last snow of April came and went in a single afternoon. By May, the South Meadow was showing green. Real green. Not the desperate pale green of early thaw, but something deep and solid. Grass pushing up through the dead winter mat with genuine intention. The creek below the canyon ran loud and fast. Every morning, Clara could hear it from the porch, before she heard anything else. She stood there now, in the early light, with her cup of nettle tea and her coat hanging open, because the air had finally stopped trying to kill her. 3 months. She'd been on this ridge for 3 months. She knew it because she'd kept the tally. She was good at tallies now. Days, the running balance of the hay costs, the head count of the cattle, the slow accumulating list of words she could read that she couldn't read before. She kept them all in a column in her head, neat and ordered, the way Gideon kept his fence line. Checked every morning. Nothing getting past. She drank her tea and watched the light come up over the eastern peaks and thought about how different the light was now from how it had been in February. Light was flat and white and dangerous, the kind that bounced off snow and got into your eyes and told you nothing. May light was something else. It came at an angle that made everything cast a shadow, which meant everything had depth, everything had dimension. She'd started seeing that way, too. Things with dimension. Things that cast shadows, which meant they were real and solid and standing in actual light. Martha's pamphlet had done some of that. The ledger work had done some of it. The nettle tea, maybe, which she'd been drinking every morning, without missing a day, because Martha had said to, and she'd decided Martha was someone whose instructions were worth following. And one morning, 4 days ago, her cycle had returned. She hadn't told Gideon. It wasn't his to know. Not yet. Not without her deciding to share it. But she'd stood in the small back room, with her hands against the wall, and breathed for a full minute. Just breathed, because Martha had said probably, and probably had turned out to be yes. And that meant her body was not the cursed and broken thing she'd been told it was. It was just a body. A healing one. Hers. She finished the tea and went inside to start breakfast. That morning, Gideon rode down to the trading post in Jasper Crossing for the first time since February. He'd been putting it off. The trail was solid enough now, and the ranch could spare him for a day. But he'd been putting it off because going to town meant moving through the world, and the world in this valley had Declan Creed's fingers in it. He went armed, which he always did, and he went with his eyes open, which he also always did, and he left Clara with a clear description of what to do if anyone came up the canyon trail while he was gone. She'd listened without expression and then said, "I know where the shotgun is." He'd looked at her for a second. "You know how to use it?" "I've watched you clean it twice," she said. "And I grew up on a commune with 200 acres of mountain terrain and people who occasionally got ideas about other people's property." She paused. "I know how to use a shotgun." He'd believed her. He left at first light and made good time down the canyon. Cabot was fresh and eager after the winter, and went at the trail with his ears up and his stride long. The lower canyon was full of sound water and birds and the soft drip of snowmelt off the pine branches. And Gideon let the horse set his own pace and thought about what he needed to do in town. Supplies, mainly. Salt and coffee and cornmeal, 2 new fence posts, a coil of wire. He needed to talk to Miller at the trading post about the route up from the southern valley that Creed's men had been using, whether Miller had seen any unusual traffic. He needed to check the mail, which he'd been ignoring since December, and which had likely accumulated into a problem. What he did not expect was to find Declan Creed at Miller's trading post. But Creed was there. He was standing at the post's covered porch when Gideon rode up, dressed well for a man who'd supposedly come up from Denver for timber business. Good coat, good hat. He was talking to 2 men Gideon didn't recognize, both of them big and both of them carrying. He saw Gideon coming and didn't change his posture or his expression, just watched him ride in with the studied calm of a man accustomed to controlling the temperature of a room. Gideon tied Cabot at the rail and went to the post without looking at Creed directly. Miller was inside, a short, quiet man who'd been running this post for 15 years and survived by staying out of everyone's business while knowing everyone's business intimately. He looked at Gideon when he came through the door, and his eyes went briefly to the porch and back. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Gideon set his list on the counter. "I'll take what's on that." Miller started pulling items without comment. The door opened behind Gideon. He didn't turn. "Shaw," said Creed's voice. It was a good voice. Smooth and measured, the kind that cost money to develop. "Wondered when you'd come down off that mountain." "Here I am," Gideon said. Creed came around to stand where Gideon would have to look at him, which Gideon acknowledged by turning to face him. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and was now just imposing. Silver in his beard, eyes that were pale and very still. "I'll buy you a drink," Creed said, in the spirit of neighborly conversation. "I don't drink before noon," Gideon said. "Coffee, then. I've got business with Miller." "Your business with Miller can wait 5 minutes," Creed said it pleasantly. That was the thing about him. He was always pleasant. It was one of the more unpleasant things about him. "Sit down, Shaw. I'll say what I came to say, and you can get back to your fence posts." Gideon looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his list and his items, and paid Miller, and put the change in his coat pocket, and turned back to Creed. "Say it here," he said. Creed looked at the porch, and then at Miller, and then shrugged, slightly, like a man who'd been given a minor inconvenience but could adapt. "I know about the woman," he said. The air in the post went quiet. Miller had moved to the far end of the counter and was suddenly very interested in something on the lowest shelf. Gideon kept his face exactly where it was. "I don't know what woman you mean," he said. "I think you do." Creed clasped his hands behind his back. "Clara Pike, née Higgins, 24 years old. Ran from her lawful husband's property in February during a blizzard. There is a marriage certificate on file and a warrant for her arrest on a charge of grand larceny." He paused just long enough for the theft of goods belonging to her husband's estate when she fled. "I'd want to see the warrant," Gideon said. "You'll see it when the deputies arrive," Creed said, "which will be a matter of days, unless we come to an understanding." He tilted his head slightly. "I have no particular interest in the woman, Shaw. She's a distraction. What I'm interested in is the water deed to your upper draw, the Abilene tributary. You've been sitting on that deed for 6 years, and you're not using half of what it entitles you to. I'll pay fair market value." "More than fair, I've told you no before." "You've told me no when you had options," Creed said, still pleasantly. "Now you have a woman in your cabin who can be removed by law at any time I decide to make a phone call to the county seat. That changes the arithmetic." He let that settle. "Sell me the deed. The warrant disappears. The deputies never come up that canyon. Your woman stays where she wants to stay." A pause. "It's not complicated." Gideon looked at him for a long, even moment. "You'd do that," Gideon said. "Use a woman's life as a bargaining chip." "I prefer to think of it as finding common ground," Creed said. "You have something I want. I have something you want. That's commerce." "Her safety isn't commerce," Gideon said. Creed's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, just slightly. The pleasant surface didn't move, but underneath it something recalibrated. "Think about it," he said. "I'll be here through Thursday." He nodded once, the gesture of a man closing a meeting, and walked back out to the porch. Gideon stood at the trading post counter for a moment. Miller came back from his shelf. "That warrant?" Gideon said quietly. "You've seen it." Miller hesitated. "Then a man brought it in 2 weeks ago. Hadn't seen him before. Rough sort." "What did he look like?" Miller described him. Gideon listened to all of it and said thank you, and picked up his supplies and went out to Cabot. He rode back up the canyon without stopping. Clara was at the table with the ledger when he came through the door. She looked up at his face, and whatever she saw there made her put the pencil down. He set the supplies on the shelf and took off his coat and sat across from her and told her plainly. He didn't soften it. She'd told him early. That first week, without quite using those words, that she'd spent her whole life being managed and handled by people who thought soft was the same as safe. He'd understood. So he told her directly. The warrant, the charge, Creed's offer and its terms. She sat very still through all of it. Grand larceny, she said, when he was done. That's the charge. I took my mother's brooch, she said. Her voice was level. It was my mother's. She left it to me before she died. Jedediah took it when we married, and I took it back when I left. She looked at the table. Nothing else, just that. I believe you, he said. She looked up. I know, she said. She stopped. Started again. I thought I was past the part where they could reach me. They haven't reached you, he said. Yet, she said. He didn't argue with the word. She was right to use it, and he wasn't going to lie to her by pretending otherwise. The man with the warrant, he said, from Miller's description. Is that Jedediah Pike? Her jaw tightened. That one muscle along the hinge of it, a small movement. Probably, she said. You knew he might come. I knew he would come eventually, she said. Jedediah doesn't leave things. He's the kind of man who... She stopped herself, looked at the brooch-shaped space in her coat pocket, the piece of fabric that had been stretched and worn thin from her fingers working it. He doesn't leave what he considers his. You're not his? I know that, she said. He doesn't. He watched her sit with that. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't retreating into the closed, careful silence she'd worn in February like armor. She was doing what he'd watched her do over the past months. With every hard thing that came at her, she was looking at it, directly, measuring it. What do you want to do? He asked. She looked at him. I want to know everything you know, she said. And then I want to think about it. So he told her everything he knew. That evening, she sat on the porch until full dark. He gave her the space. Cooked supper, left a plate on the table, went back to his own thinking at the window with his fence maps spread out and his coffee going cold beside them. She came in around 9, sat across from him, and ate the cold supper without complaining and looked at the maps. Can I see the topographic map? She said. He found it under the others and spread it flat. She looked at it. This is our canyon, she said. Her finger traced the line. That's the East Canyon, the one you came up. And this is the southern approach is Creed's timber claim on the far side. His men come up here occasionally, through that draw, he pointed. I've been documenting the incidents. If Pike is with Creed, she said slowly, he'd come up that way, most likely. Does Creed know about the East Canyon Trail? Someone does, Gideon said. I've been thinking about that. It's not on any public survey map. Only people who'd know it are people who've traveled it. She was quiet for a moment. The mail rider, she said. He looked at her. He comes every first Friday, she said. He came in February before I arrived, you told me. He comes up the lower canyon, and then he'd have to pass the East Canyon Junction. She tapped the map. He'd see the trail. And if Creed's been paying him, she let it sit there. Gideon looked at the map. He hadn't gotten there yet. He'd been thinking about Creed and Pike and the warrant and the deputy timeline, working the problem from the top. She'd come in from a different direction and arrived at something he hadn't gotten to. He didn't say anything for a moment. That's right, he said. That might be exactly right. If they know about the East Canyon, they know there's another way up. Yes. She pulled her coat tighter, without quite being aware of doing it. How long do we have, she said, before the deputies? Creed said Thursday. That could mean anything. Could be a bluff. Could be literal, he thought. Before Pike decides to move on his own, I don't know. He's here already, if that was him Miller described. He's been here 2 weeks. He's been waiting for Creed to deal with you first, Clara said. Jedediah would work for whoever was paying. He wouldn't move without being told. You know how he operates. I know how he thinks, she said. Not with bitterness. Just with the flat accuracy of someone who'd survived a decade of having to. He looked at her across the maps. She was different than she'd been in February. Of course she was, that was months ago. She'd been half dead in February. But even from last week, she was different. Something in her bearing. She sat in her chair with her full weight in it now, not perched at the edge, the way she'd done for weeks, like she needed to be able to leave. Quickly, her hands were on the table, open. She was looking at the map with the same focused certainty she brought to the ledger columns, finding errors, tracing the logic. He thought about Creed standing in Miller's trading post, with his pleasant voice and his pale, still eyes. He thought about a warrant with Clara's name on it, built on a lie, held like a tool. He thought about what Creed had called it. Commerce. "I'm not selling the water deed," he said. Clara looked up. "I didn't think you would," she said. "Which means we deal with this another way." She nodded. "Which means we deal with this another way." He refilled his coffee and brought the pot to her side of the table and filled her cup without asking. She wrapped her hands around it. "Martha," she said. "Martha," he agreed. She'd need to know what's happening. She would. She knows people in this valley, people Creed can't buy. She'd know who the reliable deputies are, if there are any, and who to contact at the county seat. "Can we get a message to her?" "I can ride down Thursday morning," he said. "First thing." That's when Creed said, "I know. I'll go at first light and be back before noon." He looked at the map again. "The important thing is to get the facts of the warrant in front of someone who can challenge them legally. The brooch was your mother's. If there's any record of that, any document, any witness from the commune." "Sister Agnes," Clara said immediately. "She was there when my mother died. She was there when Jedediah took it. She'd tell the truth. She's 80 years old, and she's afraid of nothing." A pause. Whether she'd testify is another question. "She's still in the commune. She doesn't come out." "One step at a time," he said. "First, we get the facts to someone who can use them." She was quiet for a moment. "He thinks I'm helpless," she said, quietly. "Creed, both of them. Creed and Jedediah." She looked at the map. "They made their whole plan based on the assumption that I'm a woman running and hiding, and you're a man who'll protect his water deed by protecting me, and the lever is pointing the right direction for them to push." She tapped the map, one finger, precise. "But they made the plan based on what I was in February, not what I am now." He looked at her. "What are you now?" he asked. She thought about it. For a real moment, not a performance of thinking about it. "I'm someone who can read a topographic map and a warrant," she said. "And I can do sums in my head faster than most men I've met. And I know this ranch's fence line and water draw, and the name of every cow in that barn." She looked up. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." "They think they're moving pieces," she said. "But they told you their whole plan at Miller's post. They told you the timeline and the leverage and the name of the charge." She shook her head slightly. "A careful man doesn't do that. Creed's used to winning before the other side can organize," Gideon said. "He's fast. He makes his move before anyone can prepare for it. It's worked for years. Then we organize faster than he expects," Clara said. He looked at her, across the maps and the lamplight, and the remains of her cold supper. She was looking back at him with those dark eyes, steady and direct, and he thought about the February morning he'd carried her across a yard full of snow, and he thought about the cedar peg she'd kept beside the hearth for weeks, and he thought about her sitting in the barn straw, watching Bridges' calf take its first breath, and he thought she was the most quietly determined person he had ever been in a room with. He didn't say any of that, he said. "All right, here's what we do." They worked through it until past midnight. He spread every map he had across the table, and she went through them systematically. Asking questions, he answered, noting things she saw that he incorporated. She'd never worked a tactical problem before. Or she had, just never one that anyone had called that. Running food stores for 40 women on short supply was a tactical problem. Hiding things from Jedediah had been a tactical problem. She was good at it. By midnight, they had a plan, not a complete one. Too many variables, still loose, but a skeleton, a shape. She went to bed, eventually, not because she was done thinking, but because thinking on no sleep was less useful than thinking on some. He stayed at the table a while longer. He looked at the maps, and he thought about what she'd said. They made the plan based on what I was in February, not what I am now. The fire had burned low. He reached over and pushed a log onto the coals and watched the flame catch. He thought about what Creed had said. Commerce. He'd called it commerce. The water deed in exchange for a woman's freedom to live where she'd chosen. Gideon had a deep and specific distaste for men who didn't understand what things actually were. Creed looked at a water draw and saw a resource. He looked at a ranch and saw an obstacle. He looked at Clara and saw a lever. He was wrong about all three. The water draw was an ecosystem. The ranch was a life. And Clara. He stopped that thought. He went to check the barn, the way he always did before bed. The cattle were quiet. The calves settled. Spark curled in the corner of his stall asleep. He checked Bridges' calf, checked the water, checked the latch on the barn door. He stood in the warm dark for a moment, with his hand on the latch. Outside, above the ranch, the May sky was enormous and clear and thick with stars. He'd built this place with the intention of holding it. He'd known from the first year that Creed would come for the water deed eventually, the way water found its way through the lowest crack, not because Creed was clever, but because he was relentless and had money. And he'd been doing this to small homesteaders all across the high country for a decade. Gideon had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything. Quietly, methodically, without announcing his preparations to anyone. He had things Creed didn't know about. Documents primarily. 6 years of documented incidents, cut fence posts, moved survey markers, written records of every threat and every incursion, with dates and descriptions, and in 2 cases the names of Creed's men extracted through patient observation. He had correspondence with a land attorney in Denver he'd never needed to use. He had the original water deed, notarized and registered with the federal land office, not just the county seat where Creed had friends. He'd been building a case for 6 years without knowing when he'd need it. He thought maybe he needed it now. He went back inside and stood at the dark table looking at the maps for a moment. Clara's handwriting was on 2 of them. Notes in her careful, improving script labels she'd added while they worked, a tally of distances in the margin, a small correction she'd made to one of his road estimates without commenting on it, just fixed it and moved on. He looked at that small correction for a moment. Then he went to bed. Tuesday passed and Wednesday passed, both of them working with the particular focus of people who had a deadline and were pretending not to rush. She finished the February ledger corrections and started on March without being asked. He repaired the broken section of western fence that had been on his list since the snow melted, working fast and clean. They talked over meals the way they'd been talking. For weeks, practical things, ranch things, the state of the cattle and the state of the weather, and what she'd read in the pamphlet and what question it had raised for her. But underneath the ordinary conversation, there was the other thing now, humming low and constant, not fear, just awareness. Wednesday evening, she asked him about the war. Not out of nowhere, they'd been talking about his survey maps, and she'd asked about the surveying system, and he'd mentioned learning it in the Army. And she'd asked which army, which she already knew, and then she'd asked what it was like. He was quiet for a moment. Long? He said finally. She waited. I was a scout, he said. Most of my work was alone. Moving through territory, mapping positions, reporting back. You learn to read a landscape the way you'd read a person's face, looking for what wasn't where it should be, what was too quiet, what had been moved. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The problem with learning to read a landscape that way is that you don't stop. You come home, and you're still reading it, looking for the wrong thing in every quiet. She looked at him. The fence? Walking, she said. Every morning, he said. That's why. Partly. He set the cup down. Also because Creed's men have been cutting my wire since November. A small sound from her. Mostly agreement. Does it help? She asked. The walking? Yes, he said. It helps to check and find nothing wrong. The finding nothing is the point. She thought about that. I do that with the ledger, she said, the checking. He looked at her. Every morning I go back to the previous day's entries and check them before I add the new ones, she said. I didn't realize that's what I was doing until just now. He was quiet for a moment. Does it help? He asked. Yes, she said. They looked at each other across the table. Outside the window, the May night was very dark and very clear. The stars doing what they did up here, which was everything, he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was one of the most remarkable people he'd met, not in a dramatic sense. In the specific, daily sense of someone who took the material available to her and built something solid, who found the logic in a topographic map and the pattern in a ledger column and the method in a May man's compulsive morning routine, who'd been handed almost nothing her whole life and had quietly, without making a production of it, become someone who could hold a room. He thought about Creed calling it commerce. He thought about how wrong that was. He didn't say any of it. Get some sleep, he said. I'm leaving at first light. She nodded and took her cup to the basin. At the door to the back room, she stopped. Gideon, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth at Miller's. All of it. Straight. That's the only way I know how to tell it, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes. I know, she said. That's what I'm thanking you for. She went to bed. He sat at the table with the maps for a while longer. The fire held, low and steady. Outside, somewhere above the ranch, a night bird called once and went quiet. He thought about Thursday. He thought about Martha Gable at the valley's edge, who knew people in this valley and was findable for exactly this kind of reason. He thought about a sealed warrant and a marriage certificate and a man called Jedediah Pike, who didn't leave what he considered his. He thought about Clara, standing in the lamplight, saying they made the plan based on what I was in February. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, he sat for one more minute, and he thought about the distance between February and now, and how much ground a person could cover in 3 months when they finally had solid ground to cover it on. Then he went to check the door latches, and the window bars, and the shotgun, behind the door. Everything was where it needed to be. He slept. Thursday, he was up an hour before first light. He had his coat on, and Cabot saddled, and the barn locked by the time the sky showed the first gray at its eastern edge. He came back inside for his coffee, and Clara was already at the stove with hers. She handed him a cloth bundle, cornbread from yesterday, wrapped tight. He took it. You remember everything we said, she said. It wasn't a question. I do, he said. Martha will listen, Clara said. Tell her all of it, including the part about Sister Agnes. She'll know what to do with it. I know. She looked at him, then out the window at the not-quite light. Be careful on the trail, she said. It's still wet in the lower switchbacks. I know the trail. I know you do. He pulled on his gloves. She was standing in the middle of the cabin with her coffee cup and his flannel shirt and her own growing competence around her like something she'd built herself, which she had. He looked at her for one moment in the gray pre-dawn light. Bar the door after I go, he said. Obviously, she said. He went. He was halfway to the East Canyon Trail when the sky above the Sangre de Cristo Range began slowly to go red at its edges. Not the pale watercolor pink of an ordinary sunrise. Something more saturated, deep and sure. He rode down into the canyon as the light grew around him, and he thought about the plan, and he thought about the documents in the lockbox under the barn floorboard, and he thought about Thursday. He thought, they don't know what we've built up here. They see a man alone on a ridge. They see a woman hiding. They don't see the ledger with 3 months of her handwriting in it. They don't see the survey maps with her notes in the margins. They don't see what happens when you give someone with a good mind the tools they should have had all along. They don't see what she is now. Cabot moved at a steady walk down the switchbacks, ears forward, unbothered. The red light spread above the peaks. Gideon rode toward the valley and he thought, they have no idea what they're dealing with. The morning Gideon rode down the canyon, Clara cleaned the cabin. not because it needed it. It was reasonably clean already. She'd been keeping it that way since February, finding satisfaction in the daily order of things. She cleaned it because her hands needed somewhere to go, while her mind worked, and her mind was working hard. She scrubbed the table. She swept the floor twice. She reorganized the root cellar shelf by weight, heaviest to lightest, and then reorganized it again by frequency of use. She went through the ledger for the third time that week, not because there were errors to find, but because the columns were orderly, and the orderly columns were steadying. Around 9, she went to the barn. Spark came to her immediately, as he always did. Nosing her coat pockets for the dried apple she gave it to him and stood in his stall with her hand on his neck and looked out the barn's high window at the sky. It had changed since morning. When Gideon left, the sky had been clear, just that red edge at the peaks that she'd watched from the porch. Now it was doing something else. A thin gray film had come across the high country from the northwest, the kind that moved fast and didn't announce itself. She'd lived in mountain country long enough to know that wasn't ordinary cloud cover. She went back outside and stood in the yard and looked north. The peaks were gone, not hidden by distance, hidden by weather. The upper ridgeline had disappeared behind a moving wall of gray-white that was still far off, but coming with purpose. The temperature had dropped in the hour since she'd last been out. She could feel it. The air had changed from the soft, damp cold of a May morning to something harder, something with an edge. 8 late spring whiteout. She'd heard Gideon mention them. The mountain didn't care about the calendar. May was not immune. You could get whiteout conditions in the high country in May, and sometimes in June. Brief and violent, dropping visibility to nothing and temperature by 20 degrees in an hour. She went back inside and put another log on the fire. Then she went to the window and watched the sky. Gideon reached Martha Gable's homestead a little after 9. Martha was in her garden, which she'd apparently been at since first light, turning beds and pressing in early seeds with her thumb. She stood up when she saw him coming, and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at his face and said, "Come inside." She always knew when something was coming. He'd noticed that about her years ago. She didn't ask how you were or what was the matter. She just assessed and moved inside. She poured coffee and sat. He told her everything. Creed at the trading post, the warrant, the larceny charge, Jedediah Pike. He told her about the mail rider and Clara's theory, which Martha listened to without interrupting, and then said was probably right. He told her about Sister Agnes at the commune and the brooch. Martha was quiet for a moment when he finished. "The warrant," she said. "Who signed it?" "I didn't see it," Miller said. "A rough man brought it in." "Which judge?" "I don't know." "Creed has 2 judges he can reach in this county," Martha said. "One of them I know personally, and he's straight, he wouldn't touch a fraudulent warrant. The other one I'm less certain about." She stood up and went to her desk in the corner, a solid piece of furniture covered in letters and papers, and 2 thick-bound journals. "I know a federal land attorney in Pueblo. He's handled Creed's overreach before, in the Southern Valley. He'll want to know about this. I have my own attorney in Denver," Gideon said. 6 years of documentation, every incident. Martha turned and looked at him. "You've been building a case," she said. "I've been building a record," he said, "in case I ever needed a case." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then, "Bring all of it down. Everything documented. Let me hold copies here." She turned back to the desk. "My house is harder to burn than yours." He didn't say anything to that. "It was true, Pike," she said, still at the desk. "How much of a problem is he?" "Clara says he doesn't leave what he considers his. She knows him. Better than anyone would want to," he said. Martha found a sheet of paper and began writing. "I'll send a rider to Pueblo today. He's fast and he knows the southern route, which Creed's men don't." She wrote quickly, her handwriting firm and small. "And I'll ride to the Jensen homestead this afternoon. The eldest boy is 22, and he's steady, and his father has 2 more like him. If Creed decides to move up that canyon, he won't find an empty valley. Gideon watched her write. There's a storm coming, he said. I need to get back. She looked up. How bad? Moving fast from the northwest. Clara's up there alone. Martha held his gaze for a second. Then she folded the letter and stood. Go, she said. I'll handle this end, you handle yours. He stood and pulled on his coat. Tell Clara. Martha started. I'll tell her. Tell her she's doing fine, Martha said. Better than fine, tell her. I said that. Specifically, he went. The storm hit the canyon at noon. Clara heard it, before she saw it, a change in the sound of the wind, from its ordinary voice to something lower and more serious. She was at the table with the ledger when the first real gust came through the eaves, and she stood up immediately and went to the window. White, the yard was still visible, but the tree line was gone. The snow was horizontal, driving in from the northwest, already beginning to pile against the porch rail. The temperature drop was instant and total. She could feel it through the window glass. She checked the fire, built it higher. She checked the water supply, 2 full pails inside, plus the basin. She went to the back room and pulled every extra blanket off the shelf and brought them to the main room. Then she went to the barn. The wind hit her like a wall. When she opened the door, she put her head down and went. The snow was dry and fine, the worst kind, driven so hard it found every gap, her coat and her collar, and the tops of her boots. She could barely see the barn from the cabin porch, and the cabin was 30 feet away. She got the barn door open and got inside. The cattle were already unsettled. She could hear them low sounds, movement, hooves on the barn floor. She talked to them while she moved through the stalls, the same murmuring Gideon did, steady and low. She broke the ice on the trough, which had reformed already despite the barn stove. She checked the calves. Spark pressed against her hand, and she held his face for a moment, warm breath against her cold fingers. You're fine, she told him. Storm's just noise. She went back to the cabin. She stood inside with her back against the door and listened to the wind and thought about the fact that Gideon was on the lower canyon trail somewhere, and she had no way of knowing when he'd get back or whether the trail was passable now. She thought about the warrant. She thought about Jedediah Pike, who'd been 2 weeks in the valley below, waiting. She built the fire higher and sat at the table and picked up the ledger and worked. The snow came harder by early afternoon. She couldn't see the barn anymore from the window. The yard had become a moving white field with no edges. The wind in the eaves sounded like something trying to get through, and she kept having to add wood to the fire because the drafts were finding every gap in the log walls, despite the chinking. She was not afraid of storms. She'd been through bad winters on the commune, worse than this in some ways. But she was alone, and Gideon had been gone since first light, and the lower canyon trail in a whiteout was not a safe place for a horse. At 2 o'clock, she went back to the barn to check the animals. At 3, she went again, not because they needed it, but because she needed to do something with the waiting. The cattle were settled. The stove in the barn was holding. She stayed for 20 minutes, sitting on a hay bale with Spark's head against her knee, and then went back to the cabin. At 4, she smelled smoke. Not wood. Smoke. She was burning wood. She knew that smell. This was something else. Heavier. Oilier. The particular smell of old dry hay going up fast. She was at the window before she'd finished the thought. The hay shed was on fire. It stood 60 feet from the cabin, on the far side of the yard, and through the driving snow she could see the orange light of it. The fire was in the walls already. The storm had pushed the flames horizontal, spreading them along the south face of the shed, and the snow was heavy enough to dampen the spread, but not to stop it. As she watched, the roof caught. She stood at the window for 1 full second. She thought, the cattle. If the fire spread to the barn, she thought, this isn't an accident. She went for the shotgun. It was behind the door where Gideon kept it. Double barrel, 12 gauge, both hammers down. She picked it up and checked the load the way she'd watched him. Do it, break it open, check the shells seated correctly, close it. both shells in. She brought 2 more from the shelf and put them in her coat pocket. She went to the window again. The hay shed was fully involved now. Through the whiteout, she could see the shape of figures in the yard. 3 of them, moving toward the cabin. Her heart rate went up. She could feel it in her throat. She backed away from the window, putting herself behind the wall beside the door. And she stood there with the shotgun, and she breathed. She thought about what Gideon had told her. Multiple men meant an organized approach, not a random threat. Organized meant someone had planned this. Someone had known when Gideon would be gone. The mail rider, she thought. They timed this. She heard a sound from outside off to the east. The canyon trail. A horse moving fast despite the conditions. One horse, and the sound of it was familiar Cabot's particular gait, the slightly uneven rhythm of his right fore that she'd learned to recognize over 3 months of listening to him, come and go. Then she heard something else. A crack, sharp and specific, cutting through the wind and the fire sound. A gunshot, a sound after it that was worse. Gideon had come up the canyon at speed, pushing Cabot harder than was wise on a wet trail, in a whiteout, because the smoke was visible above the ridge, even through the storm, and visible smoke from the direction of his ranch was not something he could respond to slowly. He came over the last rise into the yard at a gallop, and took in the situation in one sweep. The hayshed, burning, figures in the yard, lights moving wrong. He was already pulling Cabot around when one of the men in the yard turned and raised a rifle. The shot caught him high on the left side. Not center mass. A grazing hit, the bullet cutting across the outside of his left shoulder instead of through it, but enough. The impact knocked him sideways, and Cabot, already spooked by the fire and the noise, shied hard to the right, and Gideon went down into the snow. He hit the ground and stayed still, for one moment, assessing. His left arm was wrong. Not useless, he could still move it, but wrong. And the cold was masking how wrong. He pressed himself up with his right arm and got to one knee and pulled the Navy Colt from his holster. 2 of the men in the yard were moving toward him. He fired once, fired again. Warning shots, wide. He wasn't shooting to kill, and he knew it, and they probably knew it too. And he needed to get inside before they coordinated, and he was a man with a grazed shoulder and a revolver in the open against 3 armed men in a whiteout. He got to the porch in 5 steps and hit the door hard, and it didn't open barred from inside, which was correct, which was what he'd told her to do, and he hammered his fist against it twice in the specific pattern they'd agreed on 2 nights ago at the table. The bar scraped back. He got through the door. Clara had the shotgun up, and then she saw his face, and she had him by the right arm before the bar was back in place, pulling him toward the fire, and he was going to tell her. He was fine, but he looked at her face and decided not to bother. How bad? She said. Shoulder. Grazing hit. Left side. She pushed his coat off his left shoulder with fast hands, not gentle, which was correct. Her face was completely focused. I need light, she said. He sat where she put him on the floor beside the fire and let her work. She got his coat off and his shirt off the left shoulder and looked at the wound in the firelight. The bullet had taken a furrow across the deltoid muscle, 2 inches long and deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to compromise the joint. Clean entry, clean exit, no bullet to find. She'd seen worse. She'd treated worse on the commune because the commune's men were violent with each other and with their tools, and someone had to know what to do about it. She packed the wound with the cleanest cloth she could find, one of his flannel shirts torn into strips, and pressed hard. Hold this, she said. He put his right hand over the packing and held it. She went to her herb bag and found the yarrow she'd dried from the creek bank in April and crumbled it into the wound after she lifted the cloth. It would help stop the bleeding. Martha had told her about yarrow, specifically styptic properties, she'd said, which she'd had to look up in the pamphlet. It meant it helped blood to clot. She packed it back down and wrapped it tight with the strips. Then she went to the window. The yard was empty. No, not empty. One figure, still by the burning hay shed, standing back from it with a lantern. The other two she couldn't place. "Where's the door?" she said. "Still on its hinges," Gideon said. "I came in through." The door came off its hinges, not from the outside latch giving way. The hinge pins had been pulled, both of them, from outside, while she'd been looking through the window. It fell inward with a sound like a wave breaking, the iron hinge plate ringing on the floor, and the winter and the fire, orange and the storm came through the opening all at once. And Jedediah Pike stepped over the threshold. She knew him the second she saw him. He was built like she remembered, broad, thick through the neck, with a dark beard and hands that hung open at his sides, which she knew was deliberate. He didn't look threatening. He never had. That was part of it. He looked like a man who'd wandered in out of the cold. He had a revolver in his right hand. He was pointing it at Gideon, who was on the floor with his back against the hearthstones, his right hand over his wrapped shoulder, and his Colt across his knee, 4 feet away, and to Jedediah's left. Jedediah looked at the Colt, then at Gideon, then he looked at Clara. He smiled. It was a particular smile. She'd been on the receiving end of it for 8 years. It meant he thought he'd already won. He reached into his coat with his free hand and drew out a folded paper and held it up. "Marriage certificate," he said. "Licensed and registered. You're my wife, Clara. Under the law, you go where I go." He let the paper drop to his side. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. Last time you made it hard." The last time she'd made it hard, she'd gotten 3 broken ribs and a split lip and 4 months of being confined to a single room of the commune's East Dormitory. She knew exactly what he meant by hard. She was standing between the fire and the overturned door. The shotgun was behind her. Jedediah saw her eyes go to it, and he moved the revolver slightly, just a small motion, a reminder. "Don't," he said pleasantly. Gideon shifted on the floor. "Stay down," Pike said, still pleasantly, and looked back at Clara. "This doesn't concern you, rancher. She's not yours. She never was. You've had her 3 months, and I appreciate the hospitality. But it's time to go home." "Home," Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that, but she didn't let the surprise show on her face. "Home," he said. "Come on now. Don't make this into something." She looked at him. She looked at the man who had told her for 8 years what she was. Barren. Spent. A branch past bearing. A woman whose only use was labor, and whose body had failed at even that. She looked at the man who had taken her mother's brooch and called it his, and would have called her the same, indefinitely had she stayed. She thought about Martha Gable in her garden, pressing seeds into the earth with her thumb. Your body is your own country. No church and no man has the right to cross its borders without your welcome. She thought about Gideon, in the stall at 2 in the morning, with warm milk cupped in his hands for a newborn calf, and the word tender, and what it had meant to learn that word applied to men. She thought about 3 months of ledger work, and nettle tea, and the pamphlet by the fire, and her cycle returning on a Tuesday morning, when the light came in at its May angle, and she'd stood against the wall and breathed. She thought about the shotgun 3 feet behind her. Jedediah took a step toward her. She turned. She moved faster than he expected. She could tell by the way his hand came up, and she grabbed the shotgun off the wall with both hands and spun back and pulled both hammers with a sound that filled the room like a bell. Clack, clack. Jedediah stopped moving. The revolver was still up, but she had 2 barrels of 12 gauge pointed at his chest from 8 feet away, and he had done enough hunting to understand the mathematics. He looked at her. She looked back. She was shaking. She was aware of a fine tremor in her hands, in her arms, working up from somewhere deep. But the barrels weren't moving. Her grip was solid and her feet were planted, and she was looking down the sight at the man she'd been afraid of for 8 years, and the fear was still there. She wasn't pretending it wasn't, but it was in her hands, not in her eyes. "Put it down, Clara," Jedediah said. "Very quiet. Very careful now." "I am not property," she said. He blinked. "I am Clara Higgins." Her voice was steady. getting steadier, and I own my life. Something moved through his face. She'd seen a version of it before when she'd fought back on the commune, the rare times she had. A recalculation, the revising of an assumption. He lunged. She fired. The first barrel took his revolver out of his hand. It didn't destroy the gun. She hadn't aimed at the gun. She'd aimed at his arm, and she was not experienced enough with a 12 gauge at close range to be that precise. What happened was, the shot went wide of his torso, clipped the revolver, and the blast at that distance hit his right forearm and his knee simultaneously, with enough force to knock him sideways into the doorframe. He went down. The revolver went across the floor. Clara was already moving. She pushed past him one step over his legs, not looking at his face, not waiting to see what came next, and she went to Gideon and got her arm under his right shoulder. "Get up," she said. "Clara." "Up," she said. "Now." He's not alone. He got up. She couldn't tell how much of it was him and how much was her, but he got up, and she had the shotgun in her right hand still with one shell left and her left arm around him, and they were moving toward the back of the cabin before Jedediah had gotten fully upright in the doorway. The cellar. Gideon had shown her the cellar in March, walking her through every part of the property, the way he walked his fence line. A reinforced root cellar under the back room, accessible through a floor hatch, the hatch made of 3-inch pine planks with a drop bar on the inside. She got the hatch open with one hand. She got Gideon down the ladder. He went on his own, mostly favoring his left arm, but managing. She went down after him and pulled the hatch shut over her head. Then she dropped the bar. It was cold in the cellar and dark. She found the lantern on the shelf by feel she'd noticed it there in March, noted its position the way she noted everything now, and lit it with the matches from her coat pocket. The small flame opened up the space around them. Root vegetables in bins, jarred preserves from last fall, a sack of dried beans. The floor bar on the hatch was solid iron, 3-inch pine planks. Gideon was sitting against the far wall with his back straight and his jaw set, and his right hand over his shoulder. She crouched in front of him and checked the bandage. Still holding. The yarrow was doing what Martha said it would do. "You need to stay still," she said. "I'm still," he said. "Your color is bad. I know." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Above them, through the planks, she could hear movement in the cabin. Heavy boots on the floor. 2 sets, maybe 3, voices. Low. She couldn't make out the words. She still had one shell in the second barrel. She looked at the hatch. "If they get that open," Gideon said, "the angle is in your favor. You'd be looking up at them. They'd have to come down one at a time." "I know," she said. He looked at her. His face in the lantern light was pale and tight around the eyes, which was pain and blood loss. But his eyes themselves were clear. "You shot him," he said. "I did." "With the shotgun?" "With the shotgun, yes." She moved the lantern slightly so she could see the bandage better. "I wasn't trying to kill him. I was trying to stop him." "You stopped him. He'll have a bad arm and a worse knee," she said. "He'll live." A pause. "I want him to live. I want him to testify." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "You're thinking about the testimony already," he said. "I'm thinking about after," she said. "During is almost over. After is what matters." He was quiet. "The ledger he's carrying," she said. "Pike. His coat pocket. Inside." Gideon frowned. "What ledger?" "When he went down, his coat fell open. I saw it before I moved a small bound ledger, dark cover, in his inside pocket." "That's not his ledger. Jedediah doesn't keep ledgers. He can barely write his own name." She looked at the hatch. "That belongs to Creed." Gideon's expression changed. "If Creed sent Pike up here with documents, then he was sloppy," Clara said. "He thought this would be over fast and clean, and nobody would look at what his man was carrying." She looked at Gideon. "But it's not over fast, and his man is on the cabin floor." Above them, a sound. The hatch tried. The bar held. Voices, louder, frustrated. Then, from outside, distant, but distinct, cutting through the storm, a different sound. Multiple horses, and a voice she didn't know, carrying over the wind. calling out in a tone that was not asking. The boots on the floor above them stopped. Silence. Then, quickly, the sound of men moving toward the door. Martha Gable had sent the Jensen boys. Not a rider to Pueblo that could wait. That would come. But the Jensen homestead was 40 minutes from the valley floor, and the eldest boy, whose name was Thomas, had been watching Creed's men move up the mountain for 2 days and had been waiting for an excuse. Martha had given him one. Thomas Jensen came up the canyon trail in the whiteout with his 2 brothers and his father and a neighbor from the next homestead over. 5 men total, all of them armed, and none of them working for anyone but themselves and their own notion of what the valley was supposed to be. They arrived in Gideon's yard to find the hay shed burning and the cabin door off its hinges, and 2 of Creed's hired men standing in the yard with their weapons already down. The 3rd man, the one with the rifle who'd shot Gideon, had made for the East Canyon Trail when he heard horses coming, and Thomas Jensen's youngest brother went after him and came back 15 minutes later with the rifle, and without the man who had apparently decided the canyon trail in a whiteout was preferable to whatever was coming. Jedediah Pike was still in the cabin. He'd gotten himself to sitting against the wall, his arm wrapped in his own coat, and his knee at a wrong angle, and when Thomas Jensen came through the doorway, he looked up and said nothing. There wasn't much to say. Thomas found the hatch. He knocked twice on it. "Careful, Miss Clara. It's Thomas Jensen. My mother knows Martha Gable." "You can come up," Clara came up first. Then she reached back and steadied Gideon on the ladder, one hand on his right arm, until he was through. The cabin was cold with the door gone, the wind coming through in full force, and it smelled of smoke from the yard. 4 men she didn't know were standing in it. She looked at each of them, quickly assessing, the way she'd learned to do, and found what Gideon would have called clear eyes. No agenda in them. Just men who'd come because someone needed help, and they had decided to provide it. One of them, an older man with a gray beard, was looking at Gideon's shoulder with a professional sort of attention. "Need to look at that," he said. "Appreciate it," Gideon said. Clara was already moving toward Jedediah. Thomas Jensen stepped to intercept her, gently, and she said, "I'm not going to hurt him," which was true, and walked past him. Pike looked up at her. He was in pain, which she could see clearly. His arm and knee would need real attention, which he would get, eventually, from someone. His face was doing something complicated, the recalculation still happening. The man who thought he'd already won one revising his understanding of the situation one more time. She crouched in front of him. She reached out and opened his coat. He grabbed her wrist with his good hand, and she looked at him. "Don't," she said. He held her wrist for 1 second. Then he let go. She reached in and took the ledger from his inside pocket. She stood up and opened it. Dark cover, packed with small, neat handwriting that was not Jedediah Pike's. Survey maps folded in the back. Columns of figures on the right-hand pages. Names on the left. Some of them she recognized from things Gideon had said. Homesteaders in the Southern Valley, the ones Creed had been pressuring for years. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, a column of payments, amounts and dates, and a single initial beside each one. M. The mail rider. She stood in the cold cabin with the wind coming through the open doorway and the fire burning behind her, and she held Declan Creed's ledger in both hands and read every page of it. Then she closed it. She looked at Thomas Jensen, who was watching her with a careful expression. "I need this kept safe," she said. "Somewhere Creed's men can't reach it." "My mother's house," Thomas said, without hesitating. "Nobody goes there uninvited." She held the ledger for a moment. Then she handed it to him. He took it. "We'll need federal marshals," she said. "Not county. Federal." Thomas looked at his father. His father nodded. "Martha's sending to Pueblo," Thomas said. "She sent this morning, before the storm. Said you'd likely need it." She thought about Martha Gable at her desk, writing letters with fast, firm handwriting. "Findable," Gideon had said. "That's why she lives at the edge of it." "Yes," Clara said. "Martha would." She turned back to the room. Gideon was sitting in a chair while the gray-bearded man worked on his shoulder, replacing her field dressing with something cleaner. His face was still tight and pale, but he was watching her with those clear eyes, and when she looked at him, he looked at the ledger in Thomas Jensen's hands. And then, back at her, she looked back at him. She nodded once. He nodded once. Outside, the whiteout was beginning to thin. She could see it through the open doorway, the snow still coming, but the horizontal drive of it lessening, the world starting to reassemble its edges out of the white. The hayshed was still smoldering, the fire burned down to its wet foundation, the storm having done what it couldn't stop, but could slow. The cabin was cold, and the door was on the floor, and there was blood on the hearthstones, and a man sitting against the wall who would need to answer for things. But the ledger was in safe hands, and the marshals were coming. Clara sat down at the table, her chair, the chair she sat in every morning, to work through the ledger entries with her improving handwriting, and she put her hands flat on the surface, and she breathed. Just breathed. The fire cracked behind her. Spark was in the barn, probably confused by the noise. The nettle tea she'd left on the stove that morning was still there, cold now, waiting. She looked at the doorway where the door was going to have to be rehung, and she thought, that's tomorrow's work. Tonight, there were men who'd come up the mountain because Martha sent them, and Gideon was getting his shoulder properly dressed, and a ledger full of Creed's handwriting was in the hands of someone who could hold it safe. Tonight, that was enough. She kept her hands flat on the table, steady, not shaking anymore. The storm moved east over the peaks, and the last of the whiteout thinned, and the Sangre de Cristo range came back into view above the ridge, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent, which was fine. She'd learned to look at it straight on. The door went back on its hinges the next morning. Thomas Jensen's youngest brother had carpenter's hands, and he worked the hinge pins back into place, while Thomas held the door plumb, and their father watched with the specific patience of a man who'd built 3 structures from raw timber and knew when to advise and when to be quiet. Clara fed them all breakfast. She made cornbread and salt pork and used the last of the dried apples, and she set it on the table and let them eat without ceremony, which they did. They were the kind of men who ate when food was put in front of them and said thank you and meant it. And she found she had nothing complicated to feel about feeding people who'd ridden up a mountain in a whiteout to help. Gideon was at the table with them, his left arm in a cloth sling she'd fashioned from one of his flannel shirts. He was pale, still but clearer than last night, the color coming back in increments. He'd slept 4 hours on the floor of the cellar, which was not ideal, but was what was available. And she'd checked his bandage twice in the night, and it had held. The gray-bearded man, his name was Arlo, she'd learned. A rancher from the lower valley had done good work on the wound. He'd cleaned it properly and packed it with a poultice he'd made from something in his saddlebag. Dried herbs he kept with him, the way a soldier kept ammunition. Arnica and comfrey, he'd told her while he worked. Arnica brings the swelling down. Comfrey helps the tissue knit. Won't fix it overnight, but it'll fix it. She'd filed that next to Yarrow in the part of her mind she'd been building since Martha's garden. Jedediah Pike had been taken down the mountain the previous evening. 2 of the Jensen men on either side of him on horseback, his arm splinted, and his knee wrapped tight enough to hold for the ride. He hadn't spoken to her again. He'd looked at her once when they brought him out through the rehung door, and she'd looked back and held it until he looked away. That was the last she expected to see of him until a courtroom. She was ready for a courtroom. After breakfast, the Jensen men gathered their horses, and Thomas shook Gideon's good hand and nodded at Clara with a respect she was still getting accustomed to receiving from men she'd just met. Marshals should reach the valley in 2 days, Thomas said. Maybe 3, depending on the Pueblo road. Tell Martha I need to speak with her soon as possible, Clara said. Thomas looked at her. I'll tell her. They rode down the canyon, and the yard went quiet. Clara stood on the porch and listened to the horses go. Then she went inside and looked at the cabin, the blood cleaned from the hearthstones, the floor swept, the hatch to the cellar closed and barred again out of habit, the door on its hinges, the fire going. She went to the table and opened the ledger. Her ledger, Gideon's ranch ledger, not Creed's. Thomas had Creed's safe at his mother's house by now. She opened to yesterday's entries, which she hadn't made, and started from the morning. Head count, hay, weight, water. She wrote each number down in the column with her careful, improving hand. Gideon watched her from the chair by the fire where Arlo had told him to sit and stay for the morning. He didn't say anything. She kept writing. After a while he said, "You fired the shotgun." "I did." "You hit his arm and his knee." "Yes." "At 8 feet with a 12 gauge, he said. "That's more precision than most men manage their first time." She looked up. "I wasn't aiming for precision. I was aiming to stop him without killing him, and you thought through the testimony angle while you were down in the cellar." "I had time to think," she said. "You were sitting still." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not easy to take care of," he said. It was a quiet echo of something she'd said to him once in February, sitting by this same fire. She looked at him. "You said that to me," she said, "back at the start." "I know. And you said you weren't looking for easy." "I know that, too." His eyes were steady on her face. "I'm saying it now because it's true from both directions." She looked at him for a long moment. "Neither am I," she said. She turned back to the ledger. He sat by the fire and let her work. 2 days later, Martha came up the mountain. She came alone, which was Martha, and she came in the morning with a saddlebag full of things she'd decided they needed: more arnica, dried valerian root, 2 jars of preserved plum, and a pamphlet she'd received from Denver that she thought Clara should read next. She looked at Gideon's shoulder with the focused attention of a woman who had been assessing wounds for 30 years and said it was healing correctly and he should keep the sling for another week. He said he would. She looked at his face when he said it and apparently believed him, which Clara noted. Then she sat at the table with Clara and they talked, really talked. The way Clara had never talked with another woman in her life, because on the commune, talking honestly between women was considered an invitation to complaint, and complaint was not tolerated. Martha talked about the legal situation plainly. The Pueblo attorney had been contacted. He'd seen Creed's name on the letter and apparently said several things that Martha paraphrased with a dry precision that made Clara understand why Martha was findable and why it mattered. "The ledger is the key," Martha said. "The bribe payments to the mail rider. The fraudulent survey maps. That's not local corruption, that's federal land fraud, and that's outside Creed's reach." She folded her hands on the table. "His judges can't touch it. His deputies can't touch it. Once the marshals have that ledger, Creed's finished in this valley." "And the warrant," Clara said. "The warrant was signed by Judge Callow, who is one of Creed's men. A federal marshal supersedes county authority. The warrant disappears." Martha looked at her. "You'll need to make a statement. About the brooch, about your marriage, about what Pike carried up this mountain and why." "I know," Clara said. "I'm ready to do that." Martha looked at her for a moment. "I know you are." She said it simply, without ceremony, which was the Martha way of saying something she meant completely. "You've been ready for a while. You just needed the ground under you." Clara thought about what ground felt like when you finally had it. Solid. Even when it shook, you knew it was there. "Sister Agnes?" Clara said. "From the commune. She'd testify about the brooch." "I'll write to her," Martha said. "I have contacts in the communes surrounding county. There are ways to reach women inside those walls if you know the right people." She picked up the pamphlet she'd brought and slid it across the table. "And read this." Clara looked at it. A different pamphlet than the first, thicker, the print smaller. "Women's legal standing in the frontier territories." She turned it over. "Shorter sentences than the last one," Martha said, "but denser. You'll need the dictionary. On my shelf, I'll have Thomas bring it up." "I'll manage," Clara said. "I know," Martha said again. The marshals arrived on a Thursday. 2 of them, federal, out of Pueblo. They were not the kind of men who performed authority. They were simply authoritative, which was different. They wore badges, and they asked questions, and they wrote things down in small notebooks with a thoroughness that Creed's county judges could not override. Clara made her statement in the cabin, at the table, with Gideon across from her and one of the marshals beside her with his notebook open. She told it plainly. The brooch, her mother, the marriage, the commune, what Jedediah had taken, and what she'd taken back. She told it without ornament and without apology. The marshal wrote it all down. He asked her about the ledger. She told him about Creed at the trading post. She told him about Jedediah inside pocket. She told him about the payments column and the initial M beside each entry. The mail rider's name is Moss, Gideon said from across the table. Edwin Moss. He's been running the monthly route for 4 years. The marshal wrote that down, too. When it was finished, the marshal closed his notebook and looked at Clara. You understand you may need to appear in a federal proceeding, he said. I understand, she said. That could be 6 months from now, could be longer. I'll be here, she said. He nodded. They arrested Creed at the Jasper Crossing Hotel the following morning, where he had apparently been waiting out the storm and its aftermath, with the confidence of a man who expected his operations to run smoothly without his direct involvement. He came out onto the hotel porch in his good coat and his good hat and looked at the marshals, and then he looked at the warrant in the lead marshal's hand, and something in his face went very still. Clara wasn't there for that. She heard about it from Thomas Jensen, who'd been there, who told it straight with no embellishment, because the facts were sufficient. She was at the ranch when it happened, at the table, with her ledger, working through the week's numbers. She'd gotten to March in the correction project, all the hay weight columns properly recalculated, the systematic error eliminated, the totals balanced. When Thomas rode up to tell her, she set down the pencil and listened to the whole thing. Then she said, Thank you, Thomas. He nodded and rode back down. She picked up the pencil and kept working. That evening, she and Gideon sat on the porch. The May sky after the storm was extravagant, more stars than she'd ever seen, and she'd been looking at this sky for 3 months, so that was saying something. The cold was back, but not the February cold, just the regular high country night cold. The kind you dressed for and sat in by choice. She had her coat on. He had the left arm still in the sling. They'd eaten supper inside and come out here by unspoken agreement the way they did most evenings now, just to sit in the air for a while, just to look at what was there. It's done, he said. Not a question. The start of it is done, she said. The proceeding is later. But Creed is in custody. Creed is in custody, she said, and Pike. And the ledger is in the right hands. She looked at the dark outline of the peaks against the stars. There's still Sister Agnes. I want her to testify about the brooch. Martha will reach her. I know she will. She looked at her hands in her lap. I just want it finished. The whole thing. The warrant gone, the marriage dissolved, all of it. She paused. I want my name to be only mine. He was quiet beside her. Clara Higgins, he said. Clara Higgins, she said. Just that. The creek below the canyon ran steady in the dark, full with snowmelt doing what it always did. In the barn, Spark was probably asleep. Bridges' calf, who she'd privately named River, was probably asleep too. She thought about 8 years in a place that told her she was nothing. She thought about a cedar peg by the hearth and a man who'd stepped back and put his hands at his sides. She thought about a ledger with errors she could find and a pamphlet she was halfway through reading. She thought about a warrant with her name on it that was now in the hands of people who would make it stop being true. Gideon, she said. Yeah, I'm not afraid of the proceeding, she said. I want you to know that. I'll stand up in whatever room they put me in, and I'll tell it plainly. I know, he said, but I want you there, she said. When I do it. A pause. Not to speak for me. Just there. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. I'll be there, he said. She nodded. The stars did what the stars did up here, which was everything. She sat with him on the porch of the ranch she'd come to by accident and stayed at by choice, and she let the night be what it was. Just what was there. That was enough. The federal proceeding was in September, 5 months after the night of the whiteout, 5 months after the door went off its hinges and came back on again. By September, the Sangre de Cristo range had gone through its full spring turning and its summer, and was beginning to cool at the edges into what Clara now recognized as the particular early fall quality of high country light, longer shadows, bluer air, the aspens starting to show yellow at their tips. She'd been on the ridge for 7 months. She knew this because she kept the tally, the way she kept all tallies, in her head. And also now in a small journal, Martha had sent up with Thomas in June a blank book, plain cover, with a note inside that said, "You have things worth writing down. Write them." She'd been writing them. The morning of the proceeding she was up before the light, which she always was. She made the nettle tea. She drank it on the porch. She watched the sky go from dark to gray to the pale clear blue of a September morning, and she thought about what she was going to say. She'd rehearsed it with Gideon at the table 3 evenings in a row. He'd listened and asked questions not to challenge, just to prepare her for what the other side might ask. He'd been a scout. He knew how to prepare for a thing without knowing exactly how the thing would go. She'd learned that from watching him walk his fence line. They rode down the canyon together, Gideon, on Cabot, Clara on a steady roan mare named June that Thomas Jensen had lent for the season. The trail was dry and fast in September, the creek lower than it had been in May, and they made good time. The proceeding was held in the largest room of the Jasper Crossing mail station. It wasn't a proper courthouse. The nearest proper courthouse was 40 miles south, but a federal marshal had authority to conduct proceedings in whatever space was available, and this was available. Martha was already there when they arrived. She was standing outside the door with the Pueblo attorney, a compact man named Forsyth, who wore small round glasses and had a quality of focused calm that Clara found immediately useful. He shook her hand and said he'd read her written statement, and it was clear and complete, and she should repeat it exactly as she'd written it. She said she would. Inside, the room had benches on either side, and a table at the front where the marshal sat. Creed was at a table to the left with his attorney, a man from Denver who was expensive and knew it. Creed's coat was good. His face was neutral. He glanced at Clara when she came in and then looked away. She sat at the right table with Forsyth and folded her hands and looked at the front of the room. Gideon sat in the first row of the benches behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. It took 4 hours. Forsyth presented the ledger first, page by page, methodically, with the marshal's clerk recording each entry as it was read aloud. The survey maps, fraudulent, which a federal land surveyor had already compared against the actual registered maps and found to be altered in 6 specific locations. The bribe payments, the initial M beside each one, which Edwin Moss had already confirmed in a separate interview after being offered a reduced charge in exchange for full cooperation. Moss had cooperated fully. Clara watched Creed's attorney object to 3 separate pieces of evidence and get overruled on all 3. She watched Creed's face through it, the neutral expression working harder and harder to stay in place as the ledger pages accumulated. She thought about what he'd said at the trading post. Commerce. He'd called it commerce. A thing with a price on it could be purchased or sold out from under you. What she'd been building for 7 months on that ridge, the ledger work, the reading, the knowledge of her own body, the understanding of what was hers and what was not, and exactly where the line between them ran, none of that had a price. None of it could be presented in a courtroom and overruled. When Forsyth called her to speak, she stood. She walked to the front of the room and stood at the marshal's table, and she told it plainly. Her name, her age. The brooch, her mother, the date of the marriage, the date of her departure. What she had taken, one brooch, silver, engraved with initials, and what she had not taken. She told it without ornamentation and without trembling. in a voice that carried to the back of the room. Creed's attorney asked 2 questions on cross. The first was about the circumstances of her arrival at the Shaw Ranch, implying that a woman who'd arrived half-frozen and disoriented might not be a reliable witness. She looked at the attorney and said, "My capacity to observe and record is not affected by cold weather. I have 7 months of ranch ledger entries in my handwriting that I can produce if the court would like to evaluate my reliability." There was a brief silence in the room. Forsythe's mouth moved slightly at the corner. The second question was about her marriage to Pike and whether she considered herself bound by the certificate. She said, "A certificate signed under duress when I was 16 years old, in a jurisdiction that did not confirm my consent or my capacity to give it, is a document. It is not a fact about me." The attorney looked at her for a moment. He said, "No further questions." She went back to her seat. After Martha found her outside, the proceeding had concluded. Creed remanded to federal custody pending trial. The fraudulent surveys voided, the warrants against Clara dismissed with a notation in the record that they had been issued on fraudulent grounds by a county judge who was himself now under investigation. The marriage certificate had been referred to a family law determination, which Forsythe had told her beforehand was procedural language for its going away. Martha put her hand on Clara's arm briefly. Then she let go. "You did that very well," she said. "I told the truth," Clara said. "That's all I did. That is all you ever needed to do," Martha said. "The truth was always enough. You just needed the room to say it in." Clara looked at the mail station door, the people still filing out. She saw Creed come through it with his attorney and 2 federal men, and she watched him cross the yard to a waiting wagon. He didn't look at her. She didn't need him to. "Sister Agnes," Clara said. "Her written statement was accepted," Martha said. "She confirmed the brooch. She confirmed who it belonged to." A pause. "She also sent you something." Martha reached into her coat and produced a small cloth-wrapped object and held it out. Clara took it. She unwrapped it there in the September sunlight. The brooch was silver, oval, slightly tarnished, her mother's initials engraved on the face in careful script. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long moment, and then she closed her hand around it. "Agnes got it out," she said. "Agnes has been getting things out for 80 years, Martha said. "People underestimate old women. That's their problem." Clara held the brooch. She thought about her mother, who she remembered in fragments, the smell of her hair, the sound of her voice, reading aloud from the one book they were permitted, the particular warmth of sitting beside her. She thought about what her mother would have made of this morning. This room, this proceeding. Clara standing at the front of it and saying her own name clearly and meaning it. She thought her mother would have been glad. She put the brooch in her coat pocket, against her chest, and buttoned the pocket closed. Gideon came out of the station behind Martha and stopped beside Clara without saying anything. He looked at her face. She looked at his. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "The trial will be later, I know, but the warrant's gone." "The warrant's gone," he confirmed. She took a breath. The September air, up here, even in the valley, was already sharp with the first suggestion of fall. The aspens along the creek bank were fully gold now, bright against the dark spruce. And the light on the peaks was that particular low-angle afternoon light that made everything look like it was made of something more solid than it usually was. She looked at Forsythe, who was packing his case across the yard, and she thought about how words written down had weight, how her name written on a warrant had been a weapon, and her name spoken aloud in that room had been the opposite. How the truth she'd carried alone for years had finally been put on a table in front of people with the authority to look at it. Martha had said, "You just needed the room to say it in." She'd had the room, she'd said it. "I want to go home," Clara said. Gideon was quiet for a second, he said. Cabot's at the rail. They walked across the yard together, and she untied June and swung up, and he mounted Cabot, and they turned toward the canyon trail and the high country above it. She rode with the brooch against her chest and her face turned up toward the peaks, which were going rose gold in the late afternoon light, enormous and steady, the same mountains they'd always been. She thought about the trail going up, the aspens first, then the spruce, the creek sound changing as they climbed, the air getting thinner and colder and cleaner. Spark in the barn, who would be hungry. The ledger on the table, which had a week of entries that needed checking. The journal Martha had sent, with things in it worth writing down. She thought about a ridge where nobody came without Gideon knowing, and a cabin where the door was back on its hinges, and a hearth where the cedar peg still sat, because she'd decided it could stay now that it was a choice and not a necessity. She thought about a name that was only hers. Clara Higgins. Just that. Just exactly that. The horses moved onto the trail, and the canyon closed around them, and the valley fell away below, and she rode toward the high country, with her whole weight in the saddle, solid ground under her, not going anywhere. Late spring came to the ridge like a promise kept. The south meadow was fully green by June, real green, the kind that meant the ground had decided. The creek ran loud and cold below the canyon. The calves were months old and bold, Spark leading the others in their morning chaos around the barnyard with a confidence that made Clara laugh out loud sometimes, just standing there watching, not caring who heard. She laughed more now, the whole way not bitten off. The cabin had been repaired properly after the whiteout new chinking in the north wall, the door rehung on heavier pins, the hay shed rebuilt with timber. The Jensen boys had hauled up in April. The ranch was whole. The homestead title was registered federally. Creed's fraudulent surveys voided. The water deed secure. Forsyth had sent confirmation in May, a letter Clara had read aloud at the table, while Gideon listened with his coffee and his quiet eyes. She was healthy. That was the word she kept returning to. Healthy. Her cycle had been regular for 4 months. Her hair had weight to it again. The gray tiredness was gone from her face, replaced by something Martha had called simply good color, which was the practical woman's way of saying, you look like yourself. She ate full meals without thinking about it. She slept through the night. She'd finished the second pamphlet. She'd started a third, a medical text Martha had sent up in May, dense with correct terminology she was working through, methodically, 1 page at a time. She knew her own body now. She understood what it did and why, and what it was capable of. She knew the difference between what she'd been told and what was actually true, and the distance between those two things was so vast it still surprised her sometimes, standing at the stove or walking the fence line, how completely wrong they had been. Knowing that was its own kind of freedom. Maybe the deepest kind. She'd thought about Gideon for months. Not in a frightened way, not in the careful, watchful way she'd thought about men her whole life, always calculating exits and angles and what the cost would be. She thought about him the way she thought about the creek and the popics, pink and the evening sky, as something genuinely and specifically beautiful that she had the right to look at directly. She knew what she wanted. She'd learned enough from Martha and the pamphlets, and her own slow-returning sense of herself, to understand that wanting was not a sin, and desire was not a debt. It was just true. It was just something that was there, the way the stars were there. She'd been waiting until she was certain. She was certain. It was a warm evening in late June. The light on the peaks was that long gold that came before full dark. Gideon was at the hearth, his back to the room, feeding the fire down for the night. He'd been out on the south fence all day, and he was tired, in the particular honest way of physical work, his shoulders loose, his movements quiet. She crossed the room. She stood behind him, and then beside him, and he turned slightly when he felt her there, and she reached out and put her hand against his chest, her palm, flat and steady, against the front of his shirt. She could feel the warmth of him through the cloth, his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady. She looked up at his face. He looked down at hers. His eyes were dark in the firelight and completely open. No guard in them, Everything there to see. She unbuttoned the first button of her collar. Slowly, her eyes on his. "So we make children this way," she said. Her voice was low and certain, and entirely her own. "Can I try too?" He trembled. Not the way he had before, in February in the barn straw, when the question had undone him with its innocence. This time he trembled, because she was standing in front of him in full knowledge of herself, of him, of what she was asking, and the weight of that was more than the other had been, more complete, more real. His jaw worked once. His hand came up slowly and covered hers where it rested against his chest. He didn't answer with words. He pulled her closer with a gentleness that had nothing tentative in it, and he kissed her like a man who had been waiting a long time and was no longer waiting. And she kissed him back like a woman who had finally arrived somewhere she'd been walking toward without knowing it. She had language now for what her body was. She had Martha's words and the pamphlet's words and her own hard-won understanding of what it meant to choose. She chose him, completely, and with full knowledge. That was the thing that made it different from everything that had come before the fullness of the knowing. Her body was hers, and she was giving it freely, which meant it was a gift and not a taking. He understood that. She could feel that he understood it in every careful, unhurried thing he did. He moved with that same quality she'd watched in the barn stall. That patient steadiness, that absolute willingness to go at her pace, and no other. He asked without words, by pausing, by waiting, and she answered without words, by continuing. The fire burned low. The mountain held its summer dark over the ranch, and the stars came out thick and enormous over the high country. And inside the cabin, the world reduced itself down to just this, just them. Just the honest and unhurried union of two people who had both been through enough to know exactly what they had. After, she lay in the firelight and listened to his breathing slow beside her. She thought about what it meant to choose, to walk towards something with your whole weight and your eyes open, to know what a thing was and want it anyway, fully, with no part of yourself held back. She turned her head and looked at his face, quiet and open in the last of the firelight. She had been told what she was for 8 years, by people who were wrong. She was done being told. She reached up and touched his jaw just once lightly. He was already almost asleep, but he turned his face slightly into her hand, present even in that, and she looked at the ceiling and felt the mountain breathe around them and thought, this is what it is when it's right. Just this. 1 year. Clara kept that tally, too, in the journal Martha had sent. 1 year on the ridge since the drift fence. She wrote it down on a February morning, sitting at the table with her tea, and looked at the 2 words for a moment before turning the page. The snow outside was ordinary February snow, not malicious, just weather. She was 4 months along. She'd known since October, when she'd gone down to Martha, who had confirmed it, with the same clear practicality she brought to everything. Clara had sat in Martha's kitchen and held the information for a minute, turning it over. A body that had been told it was barren, that had been starved and worked down to nothing, that had shut itself off to survive that same body, given food and rest and time, had done what it was built to do. Martha had watched her face and said, "It's a long way from barren." "It is." Clara had. "How do you feel?" Clara had thought about it honestly. Astonished, she said, and ready. She told Gideon that evening. He'd been at the table with his maps, and he'd gone very still when she said it, and then he'd put the pencil down slowly and looked at her with that open, unguarded face, and she could see everything moving through him. Gladness, a deep and uncomplicated gladness. "All right," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "All right," she said back. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him hold it. She knew this. The child was welcome and wanted and already loved. And also, she was clear in herself that the love she and Gideon had built did not depend on it. It had been whole before. It was whole now. A child was not the reason they had chosen each other. It was what came from choosing each other freely and fully. There was a difference between those 2 things, and she understood it in her bones. Martha had told her that too, months ago, and she'd read it in the pamphlet, and she'd come to know it herself, which was the version that held. The spring brought the ranch back to life, the way it always did. The creek ran loud. The meadow greened. Spark was a year old and enormous, and still came to her coat pockets for apple, which she always had. The gate went up in May. It had been Gideon's idea the way he presented it, though she suspected it had been both of theirs in the slow, quiet way their thoughts had started to arrive at the same places. A proper gate at the head of the East Canyon Trail, where it met the road. Pine timber, solid hinged, and a sign above it that she painted herself in her own clear hand. High Pass Ranch. All are welcome here. They left it unlatched. The first person came through it in June. A woman, traveling alone with a mule and 2 saddlebags. She'd heard something in Jasper Crossing from Martha about a place up the mountain where you could stop. She was heading west, and she was frightened, and she needed 2 days of rest and a meal that wasn't jerky. Clara gave her the back room and 3 meals a day and the second pamphlet and Martha's address written on a piece of paper. The woman left on the 3rd day with more in her than she'd arrived with. Not just food, something harder to name. Clara stood on the porch and watched her go down the canyon trail and felt something she recognized from the creek sound in spring. That full, forward-moving rush. Purpose. A chosen one. By fall, they had helped 11 people through that gate. Women mostly, a few men who'd come back from the war, still carrying it. One family crossing the pass with nowhere particular to go. Gideon handled the men. Clara handled everyone. Martha sent medical supplies and reading materials, and occasionally herself, riding up the canyon on a Saturday to check on whoever was staying. They were building something. Clara wrote it in the journal, on the last page of September. She wrote it slowly, in her clear and practiced hand, and then she read it back to herself to make sure she'd said it right. She had. On a warm October evening, she sat on the porch with her hands on her belly and her face tipped up at the sky. Gideon came out and sat beside her, and they looked at the mountains together. The aspens had gone gold again. The peaks were starting to get their first white. The light was doing what the October light did, up here low and sure, making everything cast a long shadow. Everything with dimension. Everything real. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "That I almost didn't make it past that fence," she said. "But you did." "But I did." She looked at the peaks. "And now there's all of this." He didn't say anything to that. He just sat with her in the way she'd come to know as one of his best qualities. His willingness to let a thing be fully true in the air between them without rushing past it. All of this. The ranch, solid and lawful, and theirs. The gate at the trailhead, unlatched. The people who came through it and left with more than they'd arrived with. A child coming in the winter, into a house where nobody would tell them what they were for. Into a life where they'd be taught to read their own name and mean it. The creek below the canyon ran steady in the dusk. The stars came out over the Sangre de Cristo range, one by one, until there were too many to count. Clara looked at all of it and held it. Just what was there. It was more than enough. It was everything.